the ritual chamber beneath the Wormrest temple should have held. Alexstrasza had cast the working herself, hands steady over the reknitting circle that spiraled across the floor in veins of gold and green, drawing up the last unhealed scar the world still carried from the war against the nightmare. A wound in the ley lines beneath the dragonblight that refused to close no matter how many seasons passed, no matter how much life magic the Red Dragonflight poured into it. She had done this 100 times. She knew the shape of the spell the way she knew the shape of her own name. She did not know the shape of what answered. The wound in the world did not close. It opened. For one heartbeat there was only light, not fire, not the clean gold of her own magic, but something colder, something that tasted of distance and old machinery, as if a door built by hands far older than dragons had been forced rather than opened. Alexstrasza shouted something she didn't catch. Alexstrasza was already airborne, wings cracking wide, roaring a warning to the flight scattered across the temple's outer terraces. And then the floor of the world simply wasn't there anymore, and Alexstrasza was falling through a sky that had never belonged to her. She came out of it wrong-footed, disoriented, 400 feet above a landscape that made no sense, and understood, in the first clear second of it, that she was no longer falling toward home. Below her stretched a country on fire, not metaphorically. Actual fire. Actual smoke rising in fat black columns from 3 separate points along a river valley, farmhouses reduced to blackened teeth of stone, a road choked with carts and bodies, and the slow, terrible current of people trying to outrun something on foot. She smelled it before she understood it, char and rot and the particular copper tang of blood spilled in quantities the wind couldn't carry away fast enough. Her instincts, the old ones, the ones older than her name, screamed a single word: dying. Not a battle, a slaughter, still in progress, and she had fallen directly into the middle of it. She banked hard, wings catching air that felt thinner and stranger than the air of home, and looked for her flight. She found pieces of it. Alexstrasza she felt before she saw him, the old familiar thread of him in the back of her mind, disoriented but alive, some distance to the west. Alexstrasza was further still, a hot flare of fury and confusion to the south. The rest of the flight that had been caught in the rift's mouth were scattered wider than that, threads she could sense but not follow. Not yet. Not while there was a column of refugees directly beneath her about to be run down by something with too many legs and too much hunger in its shape. She did what she had always done. She went down. The things chasing the refugees were not men. Alexstrasza had fought enough wars to know the silhouette of a soldier, the discipline of a formation, and this was neither. This was a mass of gnolls and orcs and things with too many joints, moving with the loose, gleeful violence of a mob that had already won and simply hadn't finished collecting its winnings. They wore no uniform beyond scavenged human armor stripped from the dead, and they were laughing, several of them, a wet, ugly sound that carried better than the screaming did. She landed in the road ahead of the refugee column, and the ground took her weight with a shudder that cracked stone. For a moment, nothing moved. The column of fleeing people froze mid-stride, faces turned up at her, at the impossible red bulk of her, wings folding, horns catching what little sun the smoke let through, and she watched terror shift, in their faces, from one kind to another, from the horde is coming, to what in every god's name is that. An old woman near the front of the column made a sound like a sob and a prayer at once. A soldier, young, barely more than a boy, his leather cuirass scorched along one side, a crossbow trembling in both hands, stepped in front of the woman, as if his body could do anything against what stood in the road. And that, more than anything, decided her. They think I am one more thing to be afraid of, she thought. And they are still trying to protect each other from me. Get behind me, Alexstrasza said, and her voice, even shaped as carefully as she could manage it, still rolled out across the field with enough weight to bend the smoke. The horde did not understand the words. It didn't need to. The lead knoll, bigger than the others, a rough iron collar of teeth strung around its neck, some trophy of a war she knew nothing about, skidded to a stop at the sight of her, and let out a snarling command that sent perhaps 30 of its fellows fanning out into a rough half-circle, spears and rusted blades lowering, not fleeing, not yet, weighing her the way a pack weighs anything unfamiliar, as a threat to be tested before it's respected. They tested her. The first spear that reached her did not so much fail to wound her as simply cease to matter, struck her foreleg and skittered off scarred crimson scale as if it had struck a mountain, and the knoll behind it had time for exactly one confused blink before Alexstrasza breathed. She did not use the whole of what she had. She didn't need to. A narrow lance of dragon fire, controlled, precise, close to the ground. She was not here to burn a country that hadn't earned it, only to answer what had come at her. And the front rank of the horde simply ended, folded into ash and shriek in the space of a breath. The road scorched black in a clean, contained line that stopped exactly where she willed it to stop. The half-circle broke, not into flight, into a different kind of animal calculation, the pack mind recognizing, too late, the difference between prey and predator. A shaman near the rear. She marked the bone fetishes, the crude paint, the particular way it held its staff like a threat rather than a tool, began chanting something guttural and old, and Alexstrasza felt the working take shape before it landed. A curse, thick and black, meant to rot the blood in a victim's veins from the inside. It struck her. She felt it, a cold, oily pressure trying to find purchase somewhere beneath her scales, questing for a foothold the way frost seeks a crack in stone. It did not find one. Not because the magic was weak. She could tell, distantly, almost with respect, that it was a nastier working than it had any right to be, coming from a creature this crude, but because there was simply nothing in her for a curse built to sicken mortal blood to take hold of. She was not built the way this world's things were built. The curse guttered against her like a match held to a river, and the shaman's confused, furious shriek was the last sound it made before Alexstrasza ended the argument entirely. The rest of the horde ran. She let most of them go. There was a war beneath the smoke that she did not yet understand, and burning every creature that had ever swung a blade in this country was not why she had come down from the sky, if she had come down from the sky for a reason at all, rather than simply having been thrown, unwilling, into someone else's catastrophe. She turned back to the column. The soldier boy still stood there, crossbow lowered now. Not from courage exactly, but from the particular paralysis of watching something reorganize your entire understanding of what was possible in a single afternoon. "You're safe," Alexstrasza said, gentler now, and folded down into something smaller, the great weight of her true shape drawing inward, scale becoming skin, wing becoming the fall of deep red hair, until what stood in the road was no longer a mountain with wings, but a tall woman in draconic worked robes, eyes still burning the same molten gold. "For now, tell me, what is this place? What war is this?" The boy's mouth worked without sound for a moment. It was the old woman who answered, her voice cracked but steadier than his. "The Holy Kingdom, my lady," she said, as though the words themselves might ward something off. "What's left of it? The demi-humans have taken half the north. His Holiness, the Prince." She stopped, shook her head, started again. "There's no help coming. There hasn't been help coming for weeks. The Holy Kingdom." The name meant nothing to Alexstrasza, and that alone told her more than any battlefield could have. She was not merely far from home. She was somewhere entirely outside the reckoning of any map the Dragon Aspects had ever kept. No world she knew held a nation by that name, fighting a war against creatures she'd never fought before, under a sky that smelled of a magic she didn't recognize threading through the smoke like a second kind of smoke entirely. She thought of Alexstrasza, disoriented somewhere to the west. She thought of Alexstrasza, still burning with confusion and fury to the south. She thought of however many more of her flight had been scattered across however wide a stretch of this unfamiliar country, each of them waking into some fragment of the same catastrophe she'd just put out, with no more understanding of where, or when, they'd landed than she had. "I need to find my kin," she said, mostly to herself. Then, to the old woman, gentler, "Get these people somewhere safe. I'll clear what path I can." She found Alexstrasza an hour later, circling low over a burned monastery, equally as lost, equally as furious about it. He landed beside her on a ridge overlooking the valley, folding down into his own humanoid shape, silver-red hair windblown, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply stood together looking down at a war that belonged to neither of them, trying to hold the shape of what had happened to their world in the space of a single failed ritual. "The chamber didn't fail," Alexstrasza said finally. "Something answered it, something old, and not ours." "I know." Alexstrasza's jaw was tight. "I felt the door before it opened. It wasn't a rift we made. It was a rift we were pulled through. Then someone, or something, on this side wanted dragons. Or wanted something," she said. "And dragons were simply what came through the crack." She looked out at the ruined valley, the distant black smudges where 3 more villages still burned, and felt something in her chest that was older than anger, the particular, specific grief of a lifebinder looking at land that had been made to die faster than it should have. "Whatever pulled us here, Alexstrasza, we are not standing in a quiet corner of it. This is a country in the middle of being erased. Then we find the rest of the flight," he said, "before this world decides what to make of dragons it's never seen and doesn't understand." She did not tell him, not yet, about the shaman's curse that had failed to find purchase in her, or the strange, cold texture of the magic that had opened the rift in the first place. A texture she was beginning to suspect belonged to something far larger than a demi-human horde, something with the patience and precision to notice, eventually, 400 wings worth of new arrivals burning across its war zone. She only nodded, and together they rose back into a sky that was not their own, to gather what remained of a flight thrown into a war it hadn't chosen, and to find out, sooner than either of them wanted, exactly who in this world had already begun to ask what that fire in the north sky might mean. Far to the south, in a throne room built from black stone and colder silence, something with 2 small points of crimson light, where eyes should have been, had already received the first report. Alexstrasza found them by nightfall, dropping out of a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, scorched along one wing from something that had tried and failed to bring him down over what the locals, when he'd bothered to ask, had called the Katsa Plains. He landed hard, temper still running hot from whatever he'd flown through, and did not wait for greeting before he spoke. "There's a city near the plains," he said. "Or there was. Whoever runs this war burned it to the foundation stones, and left the foundation stones standing like a warning. I found 6 more of ours scattered along the way, Tirana's brood mostly, disoriented, no injuries past what the fall itself did. They're waiting a day's flight from here." He paused, and something in his scarred face shifted, uncertain in a way Alexstrasza had rarely seen on him. "Alexstrasza, something followed me part of the way. I didn't see what. I felt it, patient, watching, gone before I could turn on it. Whatever's out here, it doesn't panic at the sight of dragons. It studies them." Alexstrasza's jaw tightened. Alexstrasza said nothing for a moment, looking out at the ruined dark of the valley below, the fires finally guttering low across a landscape that had been bleeding long before 400 red wings ever fell into its sky. "Then we are already being measured," she said quietly. "Gather what's left of the flight. Whatever this world is, whatever war we've fallen into the middle of, we won't meet it scattered. and we won't meet it blind." She looked once more toward the south, toward the distant black silhouette of something vast crouched at the edge of the burning country like a held breath, and felt, for the first time since the rift had swallowed her, the particular cold certainty of a lifebinder who has just realized she has landed in a world where death itself already sits on a throne. She did not know its name yet. She would. Nea Baraja had been raised on stories where dragons burned kingdoms. She had never expected to owe one her life. It happened 3 days after the first sightings began traveling south along the refugee roads. Rumors first, the kind soldiers learned to discount, of a red beast the size of a hill that had scattered a horde raiding party without taking a wound. Then confirmation, passed hand to hand through the ragged network of scouts and messengers still holding the Holy Kingdom's collapsing lines together. Not one beast, several. A flight, moving loosely across the northern provinces, striking demi-human columns wherever they found them, and vanishing again, before any official patrol could reach the scene to confirm what its own eyes had seen. Nea's company found the aftermath of one such strike on a gray morning heavy with old smoke. A demi-human raiding party of perhaps 60, caught mid-march along the Kellart Road, reduced now to a long smear of ash and slag that stretched 100 paces, and stopped as cleanly as if someone had drawn a line with a ruler and dared the fire to cross it. No collateral scorching on the roadside grass. No stray char on the milestone standing untouched at the border of the burn. Whatever had done this, had done it with a precision that made her stomach turn over. Not the wild, indiscriminate violence of a beast, but something that had chosen, exactly, where its fire would stop. "That's not natural," said the soldier beside her, a broad-shouldered veteran named Ordvin who'd survived longer than most in a war that killed most people fast. "Beasts don't draw lines." "Maybe it's not a beast," Nea said, and did not know yet how right she was. They found the dragons themselves 2 hours later, and no rumor had prepared her for the actual shape of the thing that came down out of the low gray sky to meet them. Vast, deliberate, wings folding with a sound like a sail catching wind, scales the deep red of old wine catching what little sun broke through the smoke. She had her crossbow raised before she'd consciously decided to raise it, and beside her every soldier in the company had done the same, and none of it. She understood this with perfect clarity, watching that great head lower toward them at a speed that could have ended all of them in a heartbeat if it had wanted to. None of it would have mattered in the slightest if the dragon had come to kill them. It didn't lower into a strike. It landed a respectful distance away, folded its wings and shrank. Nea had heard of shapeshifters, werewolves in the old stories, witches who wore fox shapes. She had never imagined the sheer wrongness of watching something the size of a hill become, in the space of 3 heartbeats, a woman, tall, red-haired, dressed in robes that still carried the geometric weight of scale even in cloth, eyes that stayed the same molten gold whether she wore wings or not. "I mean this company no harm," the woman said, and her voice carried the particular, unplaceable authority of someone who had never in her existence needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I am looking for whoever commands here. I have questions about this war, and I suspect you have questions about me." Ordvin's crossbow did not lower. Nea's did, slowly, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Something in the woman's bearing, some old animal instinct that recognized authority the way it recognized danger, and understood, distantly, that this was not a thing that could be threatened into cooperation by 60 soldiers with crossbows, even if every bolt found its mark. "Who?" Nea's voice cracked. She tried again. "Who are you?" "Alexstrasza," the woman said, "of the Red Dragonflight. And you are further from a straight answer than I am, soldier. So let us begin with the one that matters most to both of us. Is this land at war with something that can be reasoned with, or only with something that can be stopped?" They brought her to the garrison at Kamivese, a half-fortified river town that had become, by grim necessity, one of the last functioning command points the Holy Kingdom's shattered army still held north of the capital. Word ran ahead of them faster than Nia's company could march. By the time they reached the gates, half the garrison had turned out to see for themselves whether the red beast of the northern rumors had truly walked into their midst wearing the shape of a woman, and whether that meant salvation, or one more catastrophe added to a war already drowning in them. Remedios Custodio met them at the gate with her sword already loosened in its scabbard, silver blonde hair pulled back tight, the Blue Roses captain looking every part the woman who had spent the last several months watching her homeland come apart and finding no version of hope she trusted anymore. "You're the one my scouts won't stop talking about," Remedios said, blunt as a blade laid flat on a table. "The one who burned out a raiding column without losing a soldier." "I lost nothing," Alexstrasza said, "because I did not fight a battle. I answered a threat that had already chosen violence before I arrived." Her gold eyes moved over the garrison, the exhausted faces, the makeshift infirmary spilling out of a converted granary, the particular gray pallor of a population that had stopped expecting anything good to happen to it. "You've been losing this war a long time, longer than you'd believe." Remedios's jaw tightened. "And here's my problem, Dragon. I've watched 3 different kinds of powerful things arrive in this war claiming they'd help us. One of them turned out to be working for the horde that's been burning us alive. So forgive me for not falling to my knees just because you're the 4th. Something moved behind Alexstrasza's gold eyes. Not offense, Nea thought, watching from the edge of the gathering crowd, but something closer to respect. "A fair suspicion," Alexstrasza said. "I'll answer it the only way that matters. I want nothing from your war that isn't already mine to want. I did not come to conquer this country, and I did not come to save it out of charity either. I came because a working I cast in my own world tore a door I did not choose, and threw my kin into the middle of your slaughter. And I find, having landed in it, that I cannot look at what's happening here and simply fly away from it. That is the whole of my claim on your trust. Take it or leave it as you see fit. But do not mistake my restraint for weakness, Captain, and do not mistake my patience for permission to test it twice." For a long moment, no one in the garrison courtyard spoke. Somewhere behind the crowd, a wounded soldier coughed, wet and rattling, in the makeshift infirmary. The smoke-gray sky pressed down over all of it, indifferent. "Your kin," Remedios said finally. "How many?" "More than I've yet accounted for. Enough that if I decide this war is worth my flight's blood, your enemies will learn what that means very quickly." A pause. "And enough that if I decide it isn't, I would rather you heard that from me directly than have your soldiers die finding it out the hard way." It was, Nea would think later, the most honest thing anyone in a position of power had said to the garrison in months. Not a promise of salvation, not a demand for worship, just the flat, unadorned truth of a very large, very old creature, stating exactly what she was and was not willing to do, and letting the humans in front of her decide what to make of it. That night, in the garrison's cramped war room, Alexstrasza sat across a map table from Remedios and a handful of the Holy Kingdom's remaining senior officers, and Nea, assigned, by whatever bureaucratic accident kept junior soldiers underfoot in rooms above their station, to stand watch by the door, listen to a war get explained to someone who had fallen into the middle of it with no context at all. "The horde isn't natural," Remedios said, tracing a scarred finger along the map's northern provinces, already shaded the deep red of territory lost. "Something's organizing it, coordinating raids that shouldn't be possible for creatures that fight each other as often as they fight us. We've a name for whoever's behind it. Jaldabaoth, a demon lord, if the reports can be trusted, though I've never seen him myself, and half of what we know is second-hand from soldiers who didn't live long enough to be questioned twice. And your own defenses? Alexstrasza asked. Your kingdom's own power, beyond soldiers with steel? A pause, weighted with something Nea recognized even from the doorway. The particular exhaustion of people who had already spent every resource they had. The Sorceress Kingdom to the south has offered aid, said one of the officers, an older man whose voice carried no enthusiasm at all for the subject. Its ruler, the Sorcerer King, Gaun, has forces in the field already, officially assisting. Unofficially, Remedios said. Half this garrison isn't sure whether we're being saved or being fattened for something worse. He's undead, powerful beyond anything this kingdom has ever fielded. And he asks for very little in return for help most of us would have died a dozen times over without. Her eyes came up to meet Alexstrasza's, hard and searching. I don't trust things that offer salvation for cheap, dragon. I've learned that lesson at cost. So when I ask you what you want in exchange for whatever you're about to offer, understand it isn't an insult. It's the only question I have left that's kept anyone alive. Alexstrasza was quiet for a long moment, and Nea, still and unnoticed by the door, watched something pass across the ancient woman's face that looked, for just a heartbeat, almost like grief. I understand the question, Alexstrasza said finally, and I'll give you the only honest answer I have. I don't yet know what I want from this world, Captain, because I don't yet know what this world is. I know a horde is slaughtering your people. I know an undead sorcerer commands a kingdom powerful enough that your own officers speak of him the way frightened children speak of storms. I know almost nothing else, and I intend to learn more before I commit my flight's fire to a war I don't yet understand the shape of. She met Remedios's eyes without flinching. What I can promise you tonight is smaller and truer. While I am deciding, I will not let your people burn in front of me and do nothing. That is not charity. It is simply who I am, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. It was not the answer the officers in the room had wanted. Nea could see that in the shift of postures, the exchanged glances, the particular disappointment of people who had hoped for an unconditional savior, and gotten, instead, an honest and uncertain ally. But Remedios, after a long moment, gave a single short nod, the nod of a soldier recognizing another soldier's code, even across a gap of species and scale that should have made recognition impossible. That's more than most have given us, she said. We'll take it. Nea found Alexstrasza alone later that night, out past the garrison's fortified perimeter, standing at the edge of the river with her human shape wrapped in a cloak someone had found for her, gold eyes fixed on the black water moving slow and cold under a sky still smudged with distant fires. Nea hadn't meant to approach. Junior soldiers didn't approach ancient dragon queens uninvited, but something about the stillness of the woman's shoulders made the distance between them feel less like a boundary and more like an invitation she hadn't noticed she was extending. On the road, Nea flushed. Yes. I don't know why. I do. Alexstrasza finally turned, and in the darkness her eyes carried their own faint gold light, like embers banked but not out. You looked at me and decided, before you had any proof one way or the other, that I might be worth trusting. That's rarer than you'd think, in any world. Most creatures decide first whether something frightens them, and build their trust or their hatred backward from that fear. You didn't. I don't know if that's wisdom or foolishness, Nea admitted. My captain would say the second. Your captain has good reason to be careful. Carefulness has kept people alive here who might not otherwise be. Alexstrasza looked back at the water. But I've lived a very long time, soldier, and I've learned that the ones who choose to hope, even when caution would serve them better, those are usually the ones worth keeping close when the worst comes. Is it coming? Nea asked, quieter now. The worst? Alexstrasza didn't answer immediately. Somewhere in the dark north, faint and distant, The sky still glowed the dull orange of something burning that shouldn't be. "I don't know yet what this world calls its worst," she said finally. "But I felt something watching my kin the day we arrived. Patient, unhurried, entirely unafraid of dragons. Whatever that was, soldier, I don't think it's finished watching, and I don't think it will remain content to watch for very much longer." Far to the south, in a black-stoned throne room lit by nothing but its own cold authority, a report reached a ruler who did not need torches to read it, concerning a red-scaled anomaly that had, in the space of a week, become the single most discussed development along an entire front of a war he had already spent considerable effort calculating to the smallest variable. He read it twice. He did not react the way a living ruler might have. No widened eyes, no sharpened breath, only a long stillness, and then a single quiet instruction to a guardian waiting patient and silent in the dark beyond the throne. "Learn what she is," the instruction said, "before she decides what we are." Alexstrasza found the Horde's true numbers 3 days later, and it nearly killed him to learn it. He'd been scouting alone, against Alexstrasza's express caution, though caution had never sat easily on him even in the old world, following a trail of burned farmsteads north along the Katsa plains, toward whatever passed for the Horde's staging ground. What he found, cresting a low ridge at dusk, was not a raiding column. It was an army. They stretched across the plain in their thousands, gnolls in loose packs, orc warbands under crude banners, ogres hauling siege engines cobbled from scavenged Holy Kingdom timber, and threaded through all of it, disciplined in a way the rest of the Horde was not. Ranks of something wolf-headed and armored that moved with genuine drill-ground precision. Cookfires stretched to the horizon. The smell reached him even at altitude. Unwashed bodies, rendered fat, the particular ammoniac reek of a camp that had stopped bothering with sanitation weeks ago because there were simply too many mouths to feed, and too little time to feed them properly. This isn't a horde, Alexstrasza thought, banking low enough to feel the heat of the nearest cook fires on his belly scales. This is a migration with teeth. He should have turned back then. He would tell himself later that he'd meant to. That one more pass, one more count of the war engines lined up at the camp's southern edge, was worth the risk. He was wrong about the risk. The bolt that took him in the wing came from nowhere he could see, and it did not simply strike him. It bit, some enchantment woven into the iron finding purchase in a way no ordinary weapon should have managed against dragonhide. A cold spreading numbness that had nothing to do with the wound itself, and everything to do with whatever magic had ridden the bolt home. He roared, more from surprise than pain, and lost 40 feet of altitude before he wrestled his wing back under control. Blood, his own, hot and wrong-smelling in this world's air, streaming back along his flank. He looked for the shooter and found, instead, a shape rising unhurried from the camp's command tent to meet him in the air. Red-skinned, horned, wings of black leather spread wide, a grin that seemed to enjoy the sight of a wounded dragon more than it feared the sight of a whole one. "Well," the demon lord said, voice carrying easily across the gap between them despite the wind, pleasant in a way that made the hair on Alexstrasza's neck stand up worse than any snarl could have. "That's new." Jaldabaoth, and beneath that borrowed shape, patient and calculating, Demiurge watched through eyes that had never once believed in the disguise as anything but a tool, had known about the dragons for 6 days. He had not, until this exact moment, believed the reports. Dragonhide that shrugs off a curse bolt meant to fell a wyvern lord, he thought, circling the wounded creature with the unhurried confidence of something that had already calculated 11 different ways this encounter could end in its favor. Fascinating. "What are you, truly? You're a long way from wherever you crawled out of," Jaldabaoth said aloud, drifting closer, wings working lazy circles in the smoke-thick air. "I've been curious about you for days now. The reports made you sound like a myth. Myths don't bleed. Alexstrasza's golden eyes narrowed, pain and fury sharpening into something colder. You command this slaughter. I administer it, Jaldabaoth corrected, almost gently. There's a difference. Though I don't expect a beast fresh off whatever door spat you out to appreciate the nuance. Tell me, does it hurt? The bolt. I had it built specifically to trouble things that shouldn't be troubled by conventional injury. I do so love a well-made tool. Alexstrasza didn't answer with words. He answered with fire. A full, furious column of it, dragon flame at close range, meant to end the conversation, and the creature asking its questions in the same breath. Jaldabaoth didn't dodge. He let it hit, wings crossing in front of him in a gesture almost theatrical, and when the flame guttered out against some dark ward woven into his very skin, he was still smiling, entirely unmarked, a faint curl of smoke rising off his shoulders like an afterthought. "Oh, that's a good one," he said, delighted. "Real heat behind it, too. I do like a partner who commits." He tilted his head, considering. "Shall we see what else you've got? I'll admit I'm rather enjoying this." What followed was not, by Alexstrasza's own later account, a fight he won. Jaldabaoth was faster than his size suggested, and cruel in the specific, surgical way of something that had planned violence as a discipline rather than an instinct. 3 more curse bolts found him from unseen positions in the camp below, while Jaldabaoth kept him occupied at range, each one biting deeper into the numbness already spreading through his wounded wing, until the numbness became something closer to paralysis, and the paralysis became a losing battle to stay airborne at all. He would have died there, likely, ground into the dirt of a demi-human staging camp, by a creature that seemed to find the entire encounter genuinely entertaining, had Alexstrasza not felt, 4 hours' flight to the south, the exact moment her kinsman's fury turned to fear. She arrived like a judgment. Jaldabaoth felt her coming before he saw her. A wrongness in the air, a pressure that made every demi-human soldier in the camp below stop mid-motion, uneasy without knowing why. And when she broke through the smoke overhead, wings blotting out what remained of the dying light, even he allowed himself a small private recalibration of the numbers he'd been running. There she is, he thought, the one they can't stop talking about. Alexstrasza, half paralyzed and losing altitude, managed one word before he lost consciousness entirely. Careful. Alexstrasza did not need the warning. She had already felt the texture of whatever curse had bitten into her kinsman's wing, cold, precise, layered with an intelligence that no wild shaman's working could have managed, and she understood, in the space between one wing beat and the next, that whatever waited below her was not a beast to be burned into ash and forgotten. "You've hurt one of mine," she said, and the words rolled out across the camp, with enough weight that entire ranks of the horde below flinched as one. "I have," Jaldabaoth agreed, entirely unbothered, drifting to a stop in the air, a respectful distance away. "He's very rude, you know. Didn't even introduce himself before setting me on fire. I'm Jaldabaoth. Delighted, truly, to finally meet the thing my whole northern front has been whispering about." "You command this slaughter," Alexstrasza said, echoing Alexstrasza's accusation. "And you find it delightful that I've come to answer for it?" "I find you delightful," Jaldabaoth said, unrepentant. "The slaughter is simply logistics. Tell me, dragon, what exactly do you intend to do about it?" I ask sincerely. "I've run several projections and I'm curious how many of them you're about to disprove." She answered with fire, the way Alexstrasza had. But where his had been fury given shape, hers was something colder and vastly more controlled, a column of true dragon flame layered with the particular, ancient authority of a life-binder's magic, meant not merely to burn but to unmake whatever wards the demon lord had used to shrug off the last attempt. It still didn't kill him. But it cost him. She watched, with grim, careful attention, the ward across his skin flare and crack under the strain. Watched him fold his wings tight and drop 20 feet in a controlled retreat, rather than the unbothered hover he'd managed against Alexstrasza, and filed that information away with the cold precision of someone who had just learned exactly how much this creature's confidence could be made to cost. "There we go," Jaldabaoth said, and for the first time something under the pleasant mask sharpened into genuine attention. "That's rather more than I budgeted for. You're stronger than the beast. Good. I do hate wasted potential." "You will release the villages you've taken," Alexstrasza said, "or I will burn this camp to its foundations and every soldier standing in it." No," Jaldabaoth said, almost apologetic. "I don't think I will, actually. Not because I doubt you could try. You clearly could, and it would be genuinely spectacular to watch. But because burning this camp accomplishes precisely nothing beyond a very satisfying afternoon for you. I am not the war. I am one administrator of it, and there are considerably larger pieces on this board than either of us." His grin widened, sharp and knowing. "But I'll tell you what I will do, since you've been kind enough to introduce yourself so thoroughly today. I'll take this fascinating data back to the people who actually make the decisions that matter, and we'll see what they make of a fire-breathing anomaly with opinions about slaughter. I suspect you'll be hearing from someone considerably more interesting than me before long." And then, before she could press the fight further, he simply left, folding backward through a rift of black smoke that closed behind him with a finality no pursuit could catch, leaving her alone above a camp of thousands of confused, leaderless soldiers, and one unconscious, gravely wounded kinsman, losing altitude fast. She caught Alexstrasza before he hit the ground. She flew him south through the night, cradling his weight in a way that strained even her own considerable strength, tracking the poison. For it was poison, in the end, whatever magic had been bred into it, through his blood, with careful, focused attention, coaxing his own body's fight against it with threads of her own life magic, layered gently alongside his failing pulse. He would live. She was nearly certain of that within the first hour, certain enough to loosen the cold knot of dread in her own chest. But the wound itself told her something she needed Alexstrasza and the rest of the gathered flight to understand before the sun rose. "It found purchase," she said, once they'd landed at the flight's makeshift gathering point. Once healers among her own kind had taken over Alexstrasza's care, and she could finally speak the words that had been sitting cold in her chest since the Demon Lord's rift closed behind him. The poison. It shouldn't have been able to. Our blood doesn't carry disease the way mortal blood does. Our bodies don't rot from a wound the way theirs do. But this magic wasn't built to poison flesh. It was built to poison whatever it found, adapting to the target rather than assuming one. That is not crude sorcery, Alexstrasza. That is a weapon designed by something that has studied exactly what kind of resistance it might one day need to overcome. Alexstrasza's face, in the low light of the healer's fire, had gone very still. "You're saying this world was already prepared for something like us. I'm saying," Alexstrasza said, "that whatever built that poison was not thinking about demi-humans and horde wars when it designed the weapon. It was thinking about dragons, or things enough like dragons that the distinction didn't matter to it. And the creature who used it against Alexstrasza all but told me, before he vanished, that he was taking word of us back to someone he considers considerably more important than himself." The gathered flight was silent for a long moment, the only sound the low crackle of the healer's fire, and Alexstrasza's slow, ragged, recovering breath. "Then we are not the strangest thing in this world," Alexstrasza said finally. "We are simply the newest." "Yes," Alexstrasza said, looking south, toward wherever the Demon Lord's rift had truly carried him, toward the black stone throne she did not yet know existed but could already feel, somehow, gathering its attention like a held breath before a storm. "And I think, before this war is finished with us, We are going to meet whoever it is he answers to. She was more right than she knew, and sooner than she expected. For even as she spoke, 3 floors beneath a throne room lit by nothing but its own authority, a report was already being prepared for delivery, and a decision was already forming about which guardian would be the first to look a dragon in the eye, and decide, with cold and total precision, exactly what kind of threat she represented. Einzualgaun had built an empire on the principle that surprises were simply information he hadn't gathered yet. He did not enjoy discovering how thoroughly this one had escaped him. The report reached him through the usual channels, Demiurge's own account, delivered with the meticulous, faintly gleeful precision the floor guardian brought to every failure he insisted on framing as a valuable data point, and Ainz read it twice in the privacy of his own chambers before he allowed himself to acknowledge, in the silence behind his own skull, that he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. A being that shrugged off a curse bolt, built to defeat conventional resistance. A being that matched Demiurge in a direct exchange of force, and cracked one of his personal wards doing it. A being that arrived, by its own account to Demiurge, through no summoning circle this world recognizes, with an unknown number of kin scattered across the northern provinces. He thought, briefly and with the old, familiar ache of it, of a game he'd played a lifetime ago, of world bosses that shouldn't have been reachable at a given level, of encounter design that assumed players would come prepared with specific counters they hadn't yet unlocked. He had no counter prepared for this. He had not known there was anything in this world that required one. Dragons, he thought. This world already has dragons. Powerful ones. The Draconic Kingdom's Platinum Dragonlord alone commands respect I've had to account for in every projection south of the Katsa Plains. But nothing in any report I've gathered describes a dragon that speaks with the authority Demiurge describes, that fights like that arrives through a door none of this world's summoning magic could have opened. He set the report down and, for a long moment, simply sat with the particular vertigo of a ruler who had spent years convincing an entire kingdom that he saw every variable coming, confronting the private knowledge that he had not seen this one at all. "Albedo," he said, and she was in the chamber before the word had finished leaving him, as she always was, dark eyes bright with an attention that made him faintly uneasy even now, after everything. "Ainsama, assemble what we have on the Draconic Kingdom's known dragon lords. Cross-reference against Demiurge's report. I want to know if there is any existing category in this world's power structure that even approximately describes what he encountered, or if we are looking at something genuinely outside the frame. At once." A pause, calculated to the exact degree of devotion she always measured out for him. "Should I ready the floor guardians for deployment?" Not yet. He considered the map spread across his desk, the Holy Kingdom's collapsing north, the demi-human horde's slow, engineered grind toward the capital, all of it a machine he had built and tended with the patience of a man who had once measured success in server uptime, rather than human lives. A new variable had entered that machine without his authorization, and his every instinct, honed across years of careful, incremental conquest, told him that the correct first move was never force. Send Cocytus, not to engage, to observe, and if the opportunity presents itself cleanly, to make contact. I want a direct account from someone I trust, not second-hand color from Demiurge's theatrics. Understood, Ainsama. Albedo's mouth curved, faint and pleased despite the gravity of the moment, the way it always did when he trusted her with something that mattered. And if she proves hostile to Lord Cocytus, then we will have learned something important very quickly, Ainz said, and I would rather learn it from Cocytus's honor than from another demon lord's amusement. Cocytus found her 3 days later, at dusk, standing alone on a hilltop overlooking a valley her flight had cleared of horde raiders that same afternoon, the ground below still smoking faintly in the careful, contained pattern she had already made a habit of, precision rather than devastation. He approached openly, in his own true shape rather than any disguise. Forearms folded in the deliberate formal posture of a warrior presenting himself without threat. Ice blue eyes steady on her from a respectful distance. "I am Cocytus," he said, "guardian of the 5th floor of the great tomb of Nazarick, sent by my Supreme One to observe and, should you permit it, to speak with you directly. I do not come to fight. I come, honorably, to understand." Alexstrasza turned to face him without alarm. She had felt him approaching for the better part of a mile, the particular cold, disciplined weight of him entirely different from the demon lord's gleeful malice, and studied him for a long moment with the calm, assessing patience of someone who had outlived a great many first encounters. "You're the first thing in this world to introduce itself before drawing a weapon," she said finally. "That alone earns you more patience than the last envoy I met." "The one called Jaldabaoth," Cocytus said, and something in his rigid, honorable bearing tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am aware of the account. It does not reflect the standard I hold for myself, or the standard my Supreme One holds for this tomb's true purpose. I regret that your first contact with anything from Nazarick was conducted with such disrespect toward an honorable opponent. You call him dishonorable, and yet you serve the same master." "I serve Einsama," Cocytus said, with the flat, unshakable certainty of absolute conviction, "who commands each guardian according to purpose. Demiurge's purpose in this war is deception and administration of the Horde's movements. Mine, tonight, is simply this: to look upon you honestly, and to carry an honest account back to the one I serve. I would ask the same courtesy of you, if you are willing to give it." There was something almost disarming in the bluntness of it. No flattery, no veiled threat, simply a warrior stating his function and asking, with genuine formality, for reciprocal honesty. Alexstrasza felt, distantly, an old and familiar respect stir for a kind of creature she recognized even in an unfamiliar world. One who had built an entire identity around the keeping of a code. "Ask then," she said. "I'll answer what I'm willing to answer." "What are you?" Cocytus asked. "Not your name. Demiurge has already provided that. What manner of being are you? That a curse built to defeat conventional resistance found only partial purchase. That dragonfire of your kind cracked a ward my fellow guardian considers among his strongest." "I am an aspect," Alexstrasza said, "one of 5 beings entrusted, in my world, with the stewardship of life itself, its birth, its healing, its continuation against forces that would see it ended before its time. I am not merely a dragon, Cocytus of Nazarick, though the shape I wear most often is a dragon's shape. I am closer, in truth, to what your own kind might call a god, if your world builds gods the way mine does." Something shifted, very slightly, in Cocytus's rigid posture. Not fear, she thought, but a recalibration, the careful mental filing of a fact that would need to be reported with precision. "My Supreme One is aware that beings of significant power exist in categories this world does not fully anticipate. I will carry this account honestly. May I ask what you intend, now that you have arrived in a war not your own?" "That," Alexstrasza said, "is the question I am still answering for myself. I did not come to conquer your world's politics, Cocytus, and I did not come merely to watch a slaughter and do nothing. Beyond that, I have not yet decided where my flight's fire belongs in a war this large, fought by parties whose true intentions I do not yet understand well enough to judge." "That is an honest answer," Cocytus said, "and I will report it as such. My Supreme One values honesty even where it complicates his own calculations. I suspect, though I do not speak for him, that he will wish to understand your intentions further before this war reaches its conclusion. I would ask, in the name of the honor I hold, that when that contact comes, you extend it the same patience you have extended me tonight." "I make no promises to powers I haven't yet met," Alexstrasza said. But I will say this much. You have earned more trust in a single conversation than the one who came before you managed in an entire battle. That is not nothing, Guardian. Carry that back to your master, as well as my name." Cocytus bowed, formal and precise, and withdrew into the darkening tree line without another word, leaving Alexstrasza alone on the hilltop once more, turning over, with the particular unease of someone who had just spoken plainly to an emissary of something far larger than she'd yet been permitted to see, the shape of the power that had sent him. Word of the dragons reached the slain theocracy through less honorable channels, and landed with considerably less patience. Zeshi Zetsume received the report in the cold stone chamber that passed, in theocracy custom, for a war council, and listened to the 6 scriptures assembled leadership argue over its implications with the flat, distant attention of someone who had long ago stopped finding human politics interesting on their own terms. A power arriving from nowhere, capable of harming even Jaldabaoth's forces, said Nishiki Enrai, arms crossed, voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had spent this entire war watching every certainty they'd built their strategy on crumble one by one. And no summoning circle in any archive we hold accounts for it. This is not the Sorcerer's Kingdom's doing. Ein Zual Gaon would not need to send observers if he'd engineered the arrival himself. Then it is a variable belonging to no one, said another of the scriptures, older, more cautious, which makes it the single most dangerous kind of variable in a war already balanced on a blade's edge. Or, Nishiki Enrai said, it is the single most valuable opportunity this war has offered us since it began. A power capable of matching Jaldabaoth's forces, unaligned, uncommitted. If the theocracy reaches it first, offers it purpose, before Ein Zual Gaon does, you would gamble the theocracy's remaining credibility on an unproven foreign god, said the cautious scripture, sharp now, on the strength of second-hand reports from soldiers who barely survived encountering it. Zeshi, silent through the exchange, finally spoke, and the chamber quieted the way it always did when she chose to. "You are all arguing about whether to use it," she said, flat and precise. "None of you have asked whether it can be used at all. I have seen what real power looks like in this war. Scriptures. I have seen what Ein Zual Gaon's guardians can do when they choose violence rather than administration. If this creature matched Jaldabaoth and drew blood doing it, then whatever it is not a tool that waits patiently to be picked up by whichever hand reaches first. It is a power that will choose its own war, on its own terms, regardless of what any of us decide in this room tonight." The chamber fell silent again, this time with the particular weight of people confronting a truth none of them wanted to sit with. That for the first time in a war they had spent months trying to control through careful, ruthless calculation, something entirely outside their calculations had arrived, and none of them, not the theocracy, not the Sorcerer's Kingdom, not even the demon lord who claimed to administer the horde itself, could yet say with any certainty which side it would ultimately choose to burn. "Then we watch," Nishiki Enrai said finally, grudging, "and we prepare an approach, careful, respectful, unlike whatever fool's errand Jaldabaoth apparently attempted. If there is a chance to bring this power to the theocracy's cause before the Sorcerer's Kingdom claims it for its own, I do not intend to let caution cost us that chance entirely. And if it refuses both of us," Zeshi said, "and chooses, instead, whatever it decides is right on its own terms?" No one in the chamber had an answer for that. It was, Zeshi thought, watching the fire-lit unease pass across every face in the room, perhaps the first honest silence this council had shared in months, the quiet, cold recognition that a war 3 factions had spent so long believing they controlled had just acquired a peace none of them could move. Far to the north, unaware of either council's calculations, Alexstrasza gathered her scattered flight beneath a sky finally clear of smoke for the first time since her arrival, and took count of what remained. Alexstrasza, Alexstrasza, healing, furious at his own carelessness. 6 others of Tirana's brood, disoriented but whole, more still unaccounted for, scattered wider than she could yet track, each one waking somewhere in this war, with no more understanding of it than she'd had on her first terrible morning here. 2 powers have already reached out to measure us, she told them, as the fire crackled low and the stars, unfamiliar constellations she did not recognize, wheeled slow overhead. An honorable one, and a dishonest one, and I suspect before long a 3rd and 4th will follow, each with their own reasons for wanting to know which way we'll turn. And which way will we turn? Alexstrasza asked. Alexstrasza looked north, toward the burned villages her flight had already saved, and south, toward the cold, patient throne she still hadn't seen but could feel, somehow, gathering its full attention at last. Toward whoever this world's people actually need us to stand beside, she said. Not toward whoever asks first, or offers the sweetest terms. I did not survive the wars of my own world by being anyone's convenient weapon, Alexstrasza, and I do not intend to become one now. Not for a demon lord's amusement, not for a theocracy's ambition, and not, however honorable his messenger proved tonight, for an undead king's calculations either. She did not yet know how soon that resolve would be tested, or by whom. But 3 floors beneath a black-stoned throne, a report from Cocytus was already being read with the same total, unhurried attention Ein Zualgaun gave to every piece on a board he had, until this week, believed he understood completely, and a new instruction was already forming, quiet and precise, for the very first direct contact between a Sorcerer King and a goddess of life, neither of them yet knew how to categorize. Grug Ironjaw had been a chieftain twice before he ever heard the name Jaldabaoth, and both times his people had starved. He remembered the specifics the way old soldiers remember specific defeats. The winter his tribe's hunting grounds had been claimed by a Baharuth logging concession that paid the local lord more in a season than his people saw in a decade. The spring 3 of his sons had died to a Holy Kingdom border patrol that shot first and asked what species they were second. He remembered the particular exhaustion of leading a people who had never once, in his lifetime or his father's, been offered anything by the human kingdoms except the back of a boot. So when the red-skinned thing calling itself Jaldabaoth had come to his tribe's winter camp 2 years past, not with soldiers, not with threats, but with an offer, Grug had listened. Land, Jaldabaoth had said, in that same easy, pleasant voice he used for everything. A place in this world your people won't have to beg humans to let you keep. All I ask in return is that you fight for it. It had sounded, at the time, like the first honest bargain anyone had ever offered his people. Grug had signed his tribe's spears to it without hesitation, and had spent 2 years since watching that bargain curdle slowly into something he was no longer certain he understood. The camp along the Katsa Plains had swollen past anything Grug recognized as a warband. It was a nation now, in size if nothing else. Gnoll clans and orc war parties and creatures he didn't have names for, all pulled together under Jaldabaoth's banner, all fed on promises of land that kept shrinking every time Grug asked how much of it would actually belong to his people once the fighting stopped. He found Redscar, war leader of the largest orc contingent, at the cook fires that night, and did not bother with pleasantries. The dragon burned Kessel's whole column 3 days back, Grug said. 60 spears, gone before they even got a formation up. And Jaldabaoth's answer to it was to go pick a fight with the thing himself and come back grinning like he'd won something. Spat into the fire. He came back alive. That's a win, against something that size. He came back and told the War Council the dragon's just another piece on the board. Grug's tusks clicked together. Old habit, old anger. You believe that? A piece. I've seen what that thing did to Kessel's men. That's not a peace. That's a god that hasn't decided yet whether it hates us. Then it's Jaldabaoth's problem to manage, not ours. Everything's Jaldabaoth's problem to manage, until it isn't, Grug said. 2 years, 2 years my people have bled for this war, and every season the land we're promised gets smaller in the telling. First it was the whole northern coast, then it was the coast, once we've secured it. Now it's territory to be determined once the Sorceress Kingdom's interests are accounted for. You hear that? Accounted for. Like we're a line item in someone else's ledger. Was quiet for a long moment, firelight moving across a face that had, Grug thought, gone considerably more tired in the last year than the year before. You think he's lying? I think, Grug said, carefully, because this was the kind of talk that got tribes purged from the War Council's favor if it reached the wrong ears. That I have never once seen Jaldabaoth afraid of anything in 2 years of fighting alongside him, and 3 days ago I watched him come back from a fight with that dragon looking, for the first time, like he'd actually had to think. That scares me more than the dragon does, because if the thing running this war is finally scared of something, that means the ground under all of us just got a great deal less solid than we were promised. Demiurge, watching the exchange from a discreet distance through a scrying working most of the camp didn't know existed, found the conversation genuinely interesting. Not threatening precisely, but a data point worth filing carefully alongside everything else the last week had produced. Grug Ironjaw's doubt is not new, he noted, with the same meticulous internal precision he brought to every observation. It has been building for 11 months, since the 3rd territorial revision. What is new is the specific catalyst. The dragon's arrival has accelerated a distrust that was already present, giving it a concrete symbol to organize around. This is worth monitoring. Doubt among the warband leadership, left unmanaged, becomes defection. Defection, at this stage of the campaign, would cost Ain Sama's timeline considerably more than the dragon herself has cost it so far. He did not intend to correct the doubt with violence. That would only confirm it. He intended, instead, the same tool he had always found most effective on creatures desperate enough to want to believe a lie. A fresh promise, specific enough to sound like truth, vague enough to cost nothing, when the war ended, and the promise inevitably evaporated. He appeared at Grug's fire that night in his demon lord shape, alone, without guards, which Grug understood, correctly, as its own kind of message. Chieftain Ironjaw, Jaldabaoth said, settling uninvited onto a stump across the fire, entirely unbothered by the way every gnoll and orc within earshot went carefully, deliberately silent. I hear doubts traveling through my camp faster than I'd like. I thought I'd address them myself, rather than let rumor do it for me. Grug's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. 2 years of fighting under this creature's banner had taught him at least that much, that flinching in front of Jaldabaoth cost more than it ever bought back. Then address them. The dragon changes nothing about what I've promised your people, Jaldabaoth said. I know the doubt going around the fires, that her arrival means the war's calculus has shifted, that promises made before her will be quietly revised now that a new power's entered the board. I want to be direct with you, chieftain, because I respect you too much to let you hear a lie second-hand. The dragon is a complication. She is not a cancellation. Your people's claim to the northern coast stands exactly as it stood before she fell out of whatever sky she fell out of. That's not what the last 3 revisions sounded like, Grug said. Every one of them started with, "This doesn't change what's owed to you," and ended with less owed than before. Something in Jaldabaoth's expression sharpened, briefly, genuine attention rather than performed patience. The look, Grug thought, of a creature recalculating a variable it had underestimated. You're not wrong to hold that account against me, chieftain. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, but consider this. Your people have taken more of this war's actual fighting and lost fewer soldiers doing it than any other contingent in this camp, precisely because I've spent 2 years making sure your tribe's spears go where they're needed, rather than where they're simply thrown away. That's not nothing. That's the difference between a chieftain whose people are used and one whose people are invested in. It was, Grug had to admit, a more careful answer than he'd expected. Not a denial, not a hollow reassurance, but something closer to an argument he could almost believe, built from a truth he couldn't quite dispute. His people had survived better than most of the Horde's other tribes. Whether that was Jaldabaoth's mercy or Jaldabaoth's arithmetic, he genuinely didn't know, and the not knowing was its own kind of exhausting. And the dragon? Grug asked. What happens to my people's promised land if she decides this war ends before we've taken it? Then we adjust, Jaldabaoth said, simply. I won't pretend to you that her arrival hasn't complicated my projections, chieftain. It has, more than almost anything else in this entire campaign. But I have adjusted for worse complications than one very large, very opinionated dragon, and I intend to adjust for this one too. What I need from you, from all my warband leaders, is patience while I do. Not blind faith. Patience. There's a difference, and I think you, of everyone in this camp, understand it better than most. Grug said nothing for a long moment, turning the words over the way he turned over every promise this creature had ever made him, weighing the parts that felt true against the parts that felt convenient, the way he'd learned to do across 2 hard years of fighting a war that had never quite been the war he'd been promised. Patience has a cost too, he said finally. My people have been patient for 2 years. There's not much more of it left to spend before the fires start asking why. Then let's hope, Jaldabaoth said, rising, the pleasant mask sliding back into place as easily as it had ever been, that I keep giving you reasons to spend a little more before that happens. He left the way he always did, abruptly, without ceremony, a demon lord's business elsewhere in a war he claimed, with maddening consistency, to be merely administering rather than driving. Grug watched him go and felt, in the specific ache behind his tusks that came from 2 years of never quite trusting an answer, even when it sounded reasonable, that patience was a currency he was running low on faster than any promised land was arriving to replace it. He was not wrong to feel it, though he would never know how right he actually was. Demiurge, withdrawing from the camp through the same discreet channel he'd arrived by, filed the entire exchange with the same cold, satisfied precision he brought to every successfully managed variable. Grug Ironjaw's doubt contained, for now, at the cost of a promise that would never need to be honored, because the war itself was never going to end the way any of the Horde's chieftains believed it would. The dragon's arrival was, if anything, a useful distraction. It gave the warband leadership a new object to focus their anxiety on, one further removed from the actual, patient machinery grinding beneath the entire campaign. The slow demographic and territorial extraction that had been the true purpose all along, dressed up in whatever language of shared cause kept the tribes fighting long enough for that extraction to finish. Grug Ironjaw is a useful chieftain precisely because he is intelligent enough to doubt and loyal enough not to act on it yet, Demiurge noted, filing the assessment away for eventual use. The dragon has, inadvertently, made him more valuable. His doubt now has a shape that isn't, Jaldabaoth is lying to us. But the dragon has complicated Jaldabaoth's plans. A far more convenient doubt to manage. I should ensure the dragon remains, in the warband's perception, a complication, rather than an opportunity. He did not, even in the privacy of his own calculations, feel anything resembling guilt about the specific mechanics of the lie. Demiurge's nature did not accommodate guilt the way a human's might have, and his devotion to Ein Sama's larger design left no room for sentiment about the disposability of tribes whose function, in the true architecture of the campaign, had always been closer to fuel than to ally. But he filed, alongside the tactical assessment, one further note, dry and precise, for his own eventual amusement, that a 2-year-old lie, however carefully maintained, grew heavier every season it went unpaid, and that somewhere beneath Grug Ironjaw's careful patience, a fire was slowly building that would, eventually, need to be answered with something more permanent than another vague promise. A problem for a later stage of the campaign, he decided, not this one. Grug did not sleep well that night, turning Jaldabaoth's answer over the way he'd turned over every answer before it, weighing the true weight of a promise against the specific gnawing feeling that had been building in his chest for the better part of a year. The feeling of a chieftain who had led his people into a war on the strength of someone else's word, and was beginning to suspect, with a certainty he didn't want to examine too closely, that the word had never been worth quite what he'd needed it to be worth. He thought, unbidden, of the dragon, the one whose fire had ended 60 of Kessel's spears in a single pass, the one Jaldabaoth himself had come back from fighting looking, for one unguarded moment, genuinely uncertain. He did not know what she wanted from this war, or whether his people would end up standing against her fire, or, improbably, beside it. But he found himself, for the first time in 2 years of fighting under a demon lord's banner, wondering which side of that eventual line actually held the promise worth trusting and understanding, with the particular clarity that comes only from long, hard-earned doubt, that he did not yet know the answer, and that not knowing it might, before this war ended, cost his people everything they'd bled 2 years to secure. Far to the south, unaware of the doubt quietly building around a cook fire on the Katsa Plains, Ainz Ualgaun finalized the terms of a very different approach, one built not on management of restless chieftains, but on the careful, formal calculus of a ruler preparing to meet, for the first time, a power he had finally admitted to himself he did not fully understand. The invitation came without threat, which was, in its own way, the most unsettling part of it. It reached Alexstrasza 3 days after Cocytus's visit, not through the Guardian himself, but through a modest, formally dressed envoy who appeared at the edge of her flight's encampment under a truce banner none of her kin recognized, and who introduced himself with careful precision as a representative of the Sorcerer's Kingdom bearing a personal request from Ainz Ualgaun for an audience. Neutral ground. A single location, a single night. No soldiers beyond what honor required on either side. He asks this himself, the envoy said, rather than through a guardian, because he wishes you to understand. He does not consider this a matter to be delegated. Alexstrasza did not like it. A king who spent this entire war conquering by inches now wants to sit across a table from something he can't yet measure. That's not respect, Alexstrasza. That's a ruler trying to learn your weaknesses before he decides whether you're worth fearing. Perhaps, Alexstrasza said. Or perhaps it's exactly what it claims to be. An attempt to understand before deciding. The same courtesy Cocytus showed me on that hillside. Either way, Alexstrasza, I would rather meet this king and learn the shape of him directly than continue guessing at his intentions through second-hand reports and a demon lord's games. She looked north, toward the war still grinding on beyond her flight's protection. Villages she hadn't reached in time, still burning somewhere past the horizon. And if there's any chance this meeting changes the calculus of that war for the better, I owe it to every soul still bleeding in it to find out. She went alone, as the terms required, to a modest pavilion erected on open ground exactly between the Holy Kingdom's shattered lines and the Sorceress Kingdom's territory, neutral in the strict, careful sense that neither side's soldiers stood within sight of it, though she did not doubt for a moment that neither side's attention had truly left it either. Ainz Ualgaun was waiting when she arrived, seated at a plain table beneath the pavilion's canopy, entirely alone save for a single attendant, a beautiful dark-haired woman standing a precise formal distance behind his chair, whose eyes tracked Alexstrasza's every movement with an intensity that had nothing to do with courtesy. He did not rise, and Alexstrasza noted the choice without offense. An undead king, she suspected, measured respect in currencies that had little to do with mortal etiquette. "Thank you for accepting," Heinz said, his voice carrying the particular flat, hollow resonance she associated, distantly, with things that no longer needed breath to speak. "I confess I was uncertain you would. Curiosity brought me more than courtesy did," Alexstrasza said, settling into the chair opposite him, gold eyes steady on the twin points of crimson light where his own should have been. "You've had guardians watching my flight for 2 weeks. I thought it time to see for myself what watches back." A fair assessment, something in his tone, she couldn't have said precisely what, given how little of him carried the ordinary signals a living face would have offered, suggested, faintly, amusement. I'll admit, unaccustomed to meeting something I cannot immediately place within an existing category. My kingdom has spent considerable effort cataloging every power this world contains. You are the first thing in some time that has genuinely surprised me." "I could say the same of you," Alexstrasza said, "though I suspect for different reasons. Your guardian Cocytus called you his supreme one, with a conviction I've rarely seen outside of true devotion. Your other guardian played games with my kinsman's life as though it were sport, and now you sit across from me offering courtesy neither of them quite managed. I find myself curious which of those is closest to the truth of you." "Perhaps all three," Heinz said, "perhaps none entirely. I find, ruling a kingdom as large as mine has become, that the truth of a thing rarely fits inside a single accounting." He folded skeletal hands atop the table, unhurried. "I will be direct with you. As I understand, directness matters to you more than flattery. I did not summon this meeting to threaten you, nor to flatter you into an alliance I haven't earned. I summoned it because a power capable of matching one of my guardians in open combat, arriving unaligned in the middle of a war I have spent considerable resources managing, is a variable I would rather understand than guess at. I suspect you want the same understanding of me." "I do," Alexstrasza said. "Then let us begin plainly. What is this war to you? Truly, not the version your soldiers repeat, or the version the Holy Kingdom's officers fear. What does Ainz Uol Gaun actually want from a country being ground to ash beneath a horde you clearly could crush in an afternoon if you chose to?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Ainz was quiet. Not the hollow, unhurried pause of a creature without breath to catch, but something closer, she thought, to genuine consideration. "Stability," he said finally. "Order, extended as far and as durably as I am able to extend it, in a world I did not build, and do not entirely trust to hold itself together, without careful management. The Holy Kingdom's collapse is a tragedy. I could, as you say, end far more swiftly than I have chosen to. I have not, because ending it swiftly would leave behind a vacuum I am not yet prepared to fill responsibly, and because, I will admit to you plainly, there is value in a controlled crisis that an uncontrolled one does not offer. Value to whom? To the Sorcerer Kingdom's long-term stability," Heinz said, "and, in my accounting, to the eventual population of whatever this region becomes once the fighting ends. I do not pretend the calculation is a comfortable one to hear stated so plainly, but I did not build my kingdom on comfortable calculations, Lady Alexstrasza. I built it on the ones that hold." There it was, the thing Alexstrasza had felt circling beneath every report she'd gathered since her arrival, finally spoken aloud without disguise. A ruler who measured the suffering of an entire nation the way a steward measures the loss inherent in any large undertaking, necessary and regrettable and, ultimately, acceptable. She had met rulers like this before, in her own world, across ages long enough to have seen every variation of the type. She had never quite grown used to how coldly reasonable they always sounded, saying it. "You speak of this war," she said carefully. the way a healer speaks of a wound that must be reopened before it can close properly. But the villages burning under that horde do not experience your calculation as a controlled crisis, Untold. They experience it as the end of everything they had. I have held the hands of soldiers watching their families die in a war they were never given the power to end faster. Tell me honestly, does that cost register at all in your accounting, or only the sum at the end of it? Something in the twin crimson lights of his eyes held steady on her, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its earlier hollow ease. It registers, he said. I would be lying to you if I claimed otherwise, and I suspect you would know the lie the moment I spoke it. I did not build this kingdom to become a creature that stops counting the cost of what it does. I built it, in part, because I remember, however imperfectly, however long ago, what it was to be someone the cost was paid by, rather than someone who pays it out. That memory does not erase the calculation, Lady Alexstrasza, but it means I do not make it lightly, whatever it may look like from the outside. It was, Alexstrasza thought, the most honest thing anyone had told her since she'd fallen into this world. Not an excuse, not a justification dressed as virtue, but the flat, uncomfortable truth of a ruler who had made peace with a cost he had not stopped counting. She did not know, yet, whether that honesty made him more trustworthy or simply more dangerous. A creature capable of genuine regret was not the same as a creature who would let that regret change his course. Then let me ask the question beneath the question, she said. What do you want from me? Neutrality, at minimum. Ein said. Your flight's fire is powerful enough to unbalance every calculation I have made regarding this war's timeline, should it enter fully on one side or the other, without my understanding of your intentions first. Cooperation, if you are willing to offer it. There is considerable good your flight could do, aligned even loosely with my kingdom's resources, that neither of us could accomplish as effectively alone. And, if I am honest, a measure of trust, because I suspect, Lady Alexstrasza, that a being who values life as fundamentally as your own account of yourself suggests, will not long remain neutral in a war this cruel, and I would rather you choose to stand where I already stand, than discover, too late, that you have chosen to stand against me. That is the most honest offer I have heard in this world, Alexstrasza said, and also the most self-interested one. You want my strength folded into your calculations before I decide it belongs somewhere your calculations don't control. Yes, Ein said, without hesitation, without shame. I will not insult you by pretending it is anything less than that. But I will say this in its defense. Every alternative to my order that this war has offered so far, the horde's slaughter, the theocracy's zealotry, the chaos of a holy kingdom too broken to hold its own borders, has cost more lives, more cruelly, than my calculations have. I do not ask you to love my methods, Lady Alexstrasza. I ask you to weigh them honestly against what this war looks like without them. She sat with that for a long moment, the pavilion quiet, except for the distant, ever-present hush of wind moving over a country still healing from wounds 3 separate powers had each, in their own way, helped to inflict. She thought of Nea Baraja lowering her crossbow on instinct. She thought of Grug Ironjaw's chieftains, though she did not yet know his name, fighting under promises she suspected were already curdling. She thought of Jaldabaoth's grin, and Cocytus's honor, and the particular unsettling honesty of the creature seated across from her now, admitting to a calculation most rulers would have dressed in prettier language rather than confess it plainly. I will not commit my flight to your kingdom's calculations, she said finally. Not tonight, and not on the strength of one honest conversation, however much more honest it was than I expected. But I will tell you this much. Untold, and I mean it as both promise and warning. I did not come to this world to be anyone's weapon, and I will not become one for you any more than I would for the demon lord who tried to charm my kinsman's blood with poison. What I will do is watch, closely, and with the same honesty you've shown me tonight, and I will judge your kingdom by what it does, not by what it says its calculations intend. If your order proves, in practice, kinder than the alternatives you named, you may find my flight standing closer to you than you expect. If it does not, then I expect I will learn precisely how much fire an aspect of life is willing to bring against a kingdom that disappointed her. Heinz finished, and there was something in the flat, hollow certainty of it that Alexstrasza almost respected. No bluster, no threat dressed as diplomacy. Simply an honest accounting of the stakes both of them understood, without needing to state them more plainly. Yes, she said. Exactly that. Heinz inclined his head, the gesture unreadable on a face built of bone rather than expression, but the weight of it landing, all the same, like genuine acknowledgement. Then we understand each other, Lady Alexstrasza, more honestly than I expected to manage tonight. I will not ask you again for commitment you are not ready to give. I will simply ensure that when you watch my kingdom's conduct in this war, you see it clearly, and trust that clarity to speak for itself. She left the pavilion as the first gray edge of dawn began climbing the eastern sky, and did not look back at the small, silent figure still seated at the table behind her, dark-haired attendant motionless at his shoulder. She had come away from the meeting with no alliance, no enemy declared, and a far more complicated understanding of the war she'd fallen into than she'd carried into it. A ruler who counts the cost and pays it anyway, she thought, rising into the brightening sky, wings catching the first true sunlight she'd seen in days. That is either the most dangerous kind of power in this world, or the most honest. I do not yet know which, but I intend to find out, and I suspect, before this war ends, the difference between those two things may matter more than anything else I learn here. Behind her, in the pavilion, Albedo finally spoke, once the dragon's silhouette had shrunk to nothing against the dawn. You gave her more truth than you have given any other power in this war, Sama. I did, Ein said, watching the empty sky where she'd vanished. Because I suspect, Albedo, that she is the first power we have encountered in this entire conflict who would have known the moment I lied to her, and because some instinct I have not fully examined tells me that whatever this war becomes in its final chapters, I would rather she remember me as honest than merely as strong. A pause, and something almost like uncertainty colored the hollow flatness of his voice. I find I am not entirely sure myself. Which of those matters more to how this ends? Alexstrasza told herself, flying south 3 days after the pavilion meeting, that she was only tracking rumor, a report from a Holy Kingdom scout of unusual movement along the border where Sorcerer's Kingdom territory met the Horde's forward lines, something large enough to be worth a dragon's attention. She did not tell herself, not fully, that she was also testing the honesty of a king who had promised her clarity rather than flattery, and that some part of her needed to see, with her own eyes, whether his order looked as reasonable from the inside as it had sounded across a pavilion table. She found Aura and Mare first, in a stretch of border forest thick with old growth and older magic, and nearly mistook them for one uneasy heartbeat, for children lost in a war zone. "You're the dragon," the girl said, before Alexstrasza had even finished landing, gold eyes bright with an interest that held no fear in it at all. An unusual thing, Alexstrasza noted, in a world that had greeted her with fear far more often than curiosity. "Everyone's been talking about you. I'm Aura. This is Mare." She jerked a thumb at the quieter boy beside her, who ducked his head and murmured something too soft to catch. "We're floor guardians. 6th floor. Well, I'm the guardian. Mare helps. I help too," Mare said, quiet but firm, and Aura grinned, as if this exact small rebellion happened often, and pleased her every time. Alexstrasza folded down into her humanoid shape, curious despite herself. "You're younger than I expected a guardian of Nazarick to be." "We're not really," Aura started, then stopped, considering. "I mean, we're old. Older than we look, probably. But yeah, we look like this. Sama made us this way. All of us guardians, we're—" She hesitated again, a rare flicker of caution crossing an otherwise open face. "We're not really born the way you probably mean it. We were made, by the supreme beings, before they left." "Left? Nazarick used to have 41 of them," Mare said, so quietly Alexstrasza had to lean in to catch it. "The supreme beings, the ones who built everything, the tomb, us, all of it. They're gone now. Sama is the only one left." Something in Alexstrasza's chest went very still. She had assumed, without quite examining the assumption, that Algaun ruled as one power among several, a singular undead sorcerer at the head of an ordinary court. She had not accounted for the possibility that everything she'd seen since her arrival, every guardian, every soldier, every foundation stone of the Sorceress Kingdom's terrible order, existed because 40 other beings like him had once built it together and then simply vanished, leaving one God King to rule alone over an empire designed by 41 hands and inherited by a single, grieving will. "He built all of this," she said slowly, "to hold together something he did not entirely build alone, and now he holds it by himself." "He doesn't talk about it much," Aura said, some of her earlier brightness dimming. "But yeah, that's basically it. Which is why—" She stopped herself again, glancing at Mare, some unspoken calculation passing between the twins about how much a stranger, however impressive, ought to be told. "Why what?" Alexstrasza asked, gently. "Why he does things the way he does," Aura said finally. Careful, slow. "Like every decision's got to account for every possible way it could go wrong, because there's nobody left to catch it if it does. I don't think humans understand that about him. They just see the scary undead king who takes over kingdoms. They don't see the part where he's basically doing all of it alone." They showed her, at her own request, a fraction of what Nazarick actually was, not the tomb itself, which Aura made clear with an apologetic shrug was not hers to offer uninvited, but the border deployment currently massing along the frontier, where Sorceress Kingdom territory abutted the Horde's eastern flank, a demonstration of scale that Alexstrasza had, until that afternoon, genuinely not conceived of as possible in this world. They came out of the tree line in ranks that did not end, skeletal soldiers by the thousand, moving with a silent, disciplined uniformity that made Alexstrasza's ancient instincts, the ones that had watched armies march since before this world's mountains had names, go cold in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. Death Knights rode at intervals through the ranks, mounted on skeletal destriers, banners of the Sorceress Kingdom snapping black and gold overhead, and behind them, further back, things she couldn't immediately place, armored constructs, war golems, creatures of a scale and craft that suggested resources beyond anything a single kingdom, in her experience, should have been able to muster. "That's not a fraction of a border patrol," she said quietly. "That's an occupying force." "It's a contingency," Aura corrected, though even her casual tone carried an edge of something more serious now. "Sama doesn't send this much, unless he's accounted for every way a situation could turn bad. He probably heard the Horde was massing something big near the border, and decided the safest response was to make sure nothing on their side even considers testing it. And if nothing tests it, then it goes home," Aura said. "Simple as that. That's the thing people don't get about him. He'd rather bring 10 times what's needed and use none of it, than bring exactly enough and have to actually use it. He hates when force is necessary. He just doesn't trust the world enough anymore to risk being underprepared for the moment it becomes necessary anyway." Alexstrasza watched the silent, endless ranks continue their disciplined advance toward a border that, she understood now, would very likely see no battle at all. Not because peace had been won, but because the sheer, overwhelming presence of that army made any alternative to peace look, to whoever commanded the Horde's forces, like a mathematically foolish gamble. It was, she thought, its own kind of violence, not the violence of a blade finding flesh, but the violence of a will so total that resistance became simply irrational. This is what an honest calculation looks like when it's backed by force, this absolute, she thought. He did not lie to me across that table. He does count the cost, and he does pay it reluctantly. But he pays it from a position where almost nothing in this world can meaningfully refuse him, and I do not yet know if that makes his restraint a virtue, or simply the one luxury total power can always afford. She found the answer to a harder question 3 miles further along the border, where a smaller contingent of the same silent army had already engaged, not the Horde's main force, but a scouting column of perhaps 200 orcs and gnolls that had, by whatever miscalculation of their own leadership, pushed too far past the agreed demarcation line separating Horde-held territory from the Sorceress Kingdom's claimed buffer zone. It was not a battle. She understood that within the first few seconds of watching it. It was an extermination, conducted with the same silent, disciplined uniformity as the march itself. Skeletal ranks advancing in lockstep, cutting down a scouting column that had no meaningful chance of retreat or negotiation. Death Knights riding down the stragglers who broke formation to run. It was over in minutes. It was, by the standards of every battle she had witnessed since arriving in this world, remarkably clean. No wasted movement, no cruelty for its own sake. Simply the swift, total application of overwhelming force against a target that had crossed a line someone else had drawn. She landed at the edge of it once the ranks had already begun their silent withdrawal, and found, among the dead, one gnoll still breathing. Young, barely more than a cub by the reckoning of his kind, a spear still clutched in a hand that hadn't managed to raise it before the end came for him. Why, she said, to no one in particular, kneeling beside him, feeling the particular grief of a lifebinder confronted with a death she had arrived precisely 1 minute too late to prevent. Did this have to happen at all? A Death Knight, still mounted nearby, turned its skull-helmed head toward her. Not with hostility, she understood, simply with the mechanical attentiveness of a soldier registering an unexpected presence. The demarcation line was crossed, it said, voice carrying no more inflection than the rattle of its own bones. Standing orders require response proportional to incursion depth. This response was proportional. He was a child. He carried a weapon and advanced past a line his own commanders were warned not to cross. The Death Knight said, without malice, without anything Alexstrasza could identify as either cruelty or regret. The order does not distinguish by age. It distinguishes by action. She said nothing further, because there was nothing to say to a soldier who had not made the policy and could not be moved to question it. The failure, if it was a failure, belonged further up the chain, to whatever calculation had decided that a clean, proportional response, applied without exception, was the more humane policy in the long accounting even when its individual applications produced exactly this. A dying cub, a spear he'd never raised, a grief that belonged to no one in the entire silent apparatus that had killed him, because no one in it had been asked to feel anything about the act at all. She held the young gnoll until his breathing stopped, because it seemed, in that moment, the only thing left within her power to offer him, and because she understood, with a clarity that settled cold and permanent somewhere beneath her ribs, that she had just seen the truest shape of the order Ain's Ualgaun had described to her across that pavilion table. Not cruel, not dishonest, precisely as reasonable, and precisely as costly as he'd promised, and precisely as unbearable to watch, up close, as any slaughter she had ever burned a horde raiding party to stop. This is the thing he counts, she thought, rising at last, wings unfurling slow and heavy against a sky gone the color of old iron. Not the cruelty of it. There is none, and that is somehow worse. The absence of cruelty, and the absence of mercy, in exactly equal measure. A system too vast and too honest with itself to bother pretending this cost less than it did. She found Cocytus waiting for her a mile further on, as if he had known, with whatever instinct guardians shared, that she would need someone to speak to before she returned to her own flight carrying what she'd just witnessed. "You saw the border action," he said. "Not a question. I saw a child die for crossing a line he likely didn't understand the meaning of," Alexstrasza said, and did not soften the words at all. "Your king asked me, 3 days ago, to judge his kingdom by its conduct rather than its promises. I have judged it, Cocytus. Tell me honestly, is that conduct something you believe in, or something you simply obey?" Cocytus was quiet for a long moment, forearms folded in the same formal stillness he'd carried since their first meeting. "I believe in honor," he said finally, "in discipline, and in the code my Supreme One built this tomb to embody. I will not pretend to you that the border policy sits easily even with me, Lady Alexstrasza. I have questioned it, in the privacy of my own thoughts, more than once. But I have also seen what this world does to itself when no such line exists at all. I have seen the horde's atrocities in villages your own flight arrived too late to save, the same as you have. Ein Sama's order is not gentle. I will not insult you by claiming otherwise, but I have not yet found, in all my long service, an alternative to it that costs less in the final accounting." "That is the same answer he gave me," Alexstrasza said quietly, nearly word for word. "Because it is the true answer," Cocytus said, "and my Supreme One has never asked me to give any other kind, even when the true answer is the harder one to carry." He met her eyes, steady, honorable, entirely without artifice. "I do not ask you to forgive what you saw today. I ask only that you weigh it, as you said you would, against every alternative this war has offered. The horde's slaughter, the theocracy's zealotry, a holy kingdom too broken to hold its own borders without help from someone. I do not know which of those alternatives you will find least unbearable, Lady Alexstrasza. I only know that my Supreme One has never once, in all my service, pretended to me that the cost of his order was small. He has only argued, and I believe him, that it is smaller than the alternatives." She flew north alone after that, back toward her own flight and the war she had not yet decided where to stand within, carrying the weight of a dying cub's last breath and an honest king's honest, unbearable calculation in equal measure. Understanding, for the first time since the rift had thrown her into this world, that she had not fallen into a simple war between good and evil at all, but into something far harder to burn a clean line through. A conflict where every power she'd met so far, honorable or dishonest, kind or terrible, had built its own entirely defensible argument for why its particular cruelty was the necessary one, and where the true cost of choosing a side might not be measured in the fire she brought to the fight, but in which unbearable calculation she ultimately decided she could live beside. The village had been called Rayhurst, and by the time Nea Baraha's patrol reached it, there was almost nothing left to name. She had seen death since this war began, more of it than she'd ever imagined a person could hold in memory and still function. She had not seen this. The horde had not simply razed Rayhurst, they had taken their time with it, and the evidence of that patience was scattered across the village square in a way that made 3 of the veteran soldiers in her patrol turn aside to be sick, and made Nea herself go very still and very quiet, the particular stillness of someone whose mind had decided, for its own protection, to simply stop processing what her eyes kept reporting. "This wasn't raiding," Ordvin said. voice flat with the specific horror of a man who had thought he'd already seen the worst this war had to offer. Raiding takes what it wants and moves on. This was... He didn't finish the sentence. There wasn't a word in his vocabulary for what this was, and Nea understood, watching him fail to find one, that there might not be a word for it in any vocabulary at all. They found survivors eventually, 6 of them, hiding in a grain cellar that had held by sheer luck rather than any defense, an old woman, and 5 children who hadn't spoken since the horde moved on, and did not speak now, only stared at the soldiers who'd come to rescue them, with the particular blankness of people whose capacity for fear had been used up entirely and replaced with nothing at all. Nea knelt in front of the oldest child, a boy of perhaps 10, and did not know what to say to him, so she said nothing, only stayed close and steady, and let her presence be whatever small, useless comfort a stranger's stillness could offer. "Why?" she asked Ordvin quietly, once the survivors had been gathered and the patrol had begun the grim work of counting what remained of Rayhurst's dead. Would they do this? The dragons have been cutting their raiding columns to pieces for weeks. You'd think they'd pull back, consolidate, fight smarter. Not, she gestured helplessly at the square. Not this. Maybe that's exactly why, Ordvin said, grim. Maybe this is what a losing side does when it's got nothing left to lose but cruelty. He was closer to the truth than either of them knew, though the actual mechanism behind it was considerably colder than mere desperation. Deep within the Horde's staging camp, the order that had produced Rayhurst's ruin had come from a source Grug Ironjaw had never trusted, and now actively feared. A war leader named Skarn Bloodmaw, a hobgoblin commander who had risen through the ranks over the past year by being, consistently, the most willing among the Horde's leadership to escalate wherever Jaldabaoth's careful management left an opening for ambition. Grug found him at the cook fires the night after Rayhurst, flanked by a dozen of his own loyalists, and did not bother hiding his disgust. "You slaughtered a village that had already surrendered," Grug said. "Women, children. What did that buy us, Skarn? What does that buy anyone? Except giving the humans one more reason to fight instead of run." Skarn's grin showed too many teeth. "It buys morale, Ironjaw. My soldiers needed a win they could feel with their hands. Not another season of watching that red beast burn our columns from the sky, while Jaldabaoth tells us to be patient." He spat into the fire. 2 years of patience. I'm done being patient for a demon who talks pretty and delivers nothing. "So your answer is to butcher children." "My answer," Skarn said, "is to remind this war who's actually doing the fighting, while Jaldabaoth sits in his tent making projections. You want to keep waiting on his promises, Ironjaw. You go right ahead. Some of us decided we'd rather take what we can hold with our own hands than wait for a demon lord's arithmetic to finally pay out." Grug said nothing further, because there was nothing left to say to a commander who had stopped listening to anything but his own frustration months ago. But he felt, walking back to his own fire through a camp that suddenly seemed considerably less unified than it had 2 years before, the specific cold dread of a chieftain watching an already fragile coalition begin, quietly and dangerously, to fracture from within. Demiurge received word of Rayhurst with something closer to genuine irritation than his usual clinical calm. "Skarn Bloodmaw has exceeded his operational parameters," he noted, reviewing the reports with the same meticulous precision he brought to every miscalculation that wasn't his own. "A massacre of this scale, this publicly documented, accomplishes nothing that serves the campaign's actual objectives and considerably complicates the Horde's internal cohesion, given Grug Ironjaw's documented doubts. Worse, it provides the dragon with an unambiguous, undeniable justification to escalate her involvement beyond the careful neutrality she has maintained thus far." He was right to worry. Word of Rayhurst reached Alexstrasza's flight within a day, carried by a Holy Kingdom messenger too shaken to soften any part of the account, and she listened to the full report in silence that grew colder with every detail, until Alexstrasza, watching her, understood that whatever restraint she had maintained since her arrival in this world had just found its outer limit. "You said you would not become anyone's weapon," he said carefully. "Not the demon lords, not the Sorcerer Kings." "I am not becoming a weapon," Alexstrasza said, and her voice carried a stillness more dangerous than any fury he'd heard from her before. "I am choosing, Alexstrasza, to stop pretending that neutrality is a virtue in a war where one side has just proven it will do this to children when it runs low on patience. I did not come to this world to judge every faction equally, regardless of what they do. I came to protect life where I find it threatened." Rayhurst was a test of exactly how far I was willing to let that principle bend before I broke it myself. I will not fail that test twice. "What do you intend?" "I intend to make Skarn Bloodmaw's name the last thing his soldiers ever fear more than they fear me," Alexstrasza said, and rose into a sky already darkening toward evening, wings catching the last orange light like something ancient and finally fully awake. She found the responsible warband 3 days later, encamped along a tributary of the Katsa River, still flush with whatever grim satisfaction Rayhurst's slaughter had bought them. And she did not announce herself with words this time. She came down out of a clear sky at dusk, and the fire that followed was not the careful, contained line she'd drawn on her very first day in this world. It was total, and it was merciless. And it ended in minutes what Skarn Bloodmaw's warband had spent months building. Not a village this time, not innocents caught between armies, but soldiers who had, by their own commander's boast, chosen cruelty as strategy, and paid, in full, the price that strategy demanded from something that had decided, finally, exactly how much cruelty it was willing to witness, without answering it in kind. Skarn himself she found at the end of it, cornered against the riverbank, sword drawn in a hand that had already stopped believing it would matter. "You'll answer for Rayhurst," Alexstrasza said, and her voice this time held none of the restraint she'd shown Jaldabaoth on their first meeting. "It was war," Skarn spat, "the last defiance of something that had built its entire identity on being the Horde's sharpest edge, and had never, until this exact moment, faced an edge sharper than its own. You think your fire makes you better than what I did. You've killed hundreds since you fell out of that sky. What's the difference?" "The difference," Alexstrasza said, "is that every soldier I have killed died with a weapon in hand, choosing violence in the moment I answered it. You slaughtered children who had already surrendered, and called it morale." She looked at him for a long, cold moment, weighing something he could not follow, some calculation of mercy against consequence that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the particular grief of a lifebinder who had just spent 3 days holding the memory of a dying cub she'd arrived 1 minute too late to save. "I will not pretend killing you undoes what you did, but I will make certain, Skarn Bloodmaw, that no commander in this horde ever again mistakes patience for permission." Grug Ironjaw heard what happened to Skarn's warband before the sun rose the next morning, and felt, listening to the account, a complicated grief he hadn't expected to feel for a commander he'd genuinely despised. Not grief for Skarn himself, but for the particular, final proof it represented. That whatever fragile unity Jaldabaoth's 2 years of careful promises had built across this horde was now cracking under the weight of its own worst impulses, and that the dragon, whatever else she was, had just demonstrated with total, terrible clarity exactly where her patience ended. He found Ung Redscar at the cookfires that night, and this time it was Ung who spoke first. "Skarn's dead," Ung said, his whole warband with him. She didn't even slow down to negotiate. "Good," Grug said, and meant it, and hated, a little, that he meant it. "He butchered children, Ung. Whatever else that dragon is." She answered something that needed answering. and Jaldabaoth's been too busy managing his projections to answer it himself. "You're taking her side now?" "I'm not taking anyone's side," Grug said. "I'm saying that 2 years into this war, the only power that's shown my people anything resembling a consistent principle isn't the demon lord who's been feeding us promises he never intends to keep. It's the thing that came out of nowhere and has, so far, only ever burned exactly what earned her fire, and nothing more." He stared into the flames for a long moment, turning over a thought he hadn't let himself fully form until tonight. "I don't know what that means for us, Ung. I don't know if my people belong on her side of this war, or Jaldabaoth's, or somewhere that hasn't been invented yet. But I know I'm done pretending the Demon Lord's arithmetic is the only arithmetic that matters in deciding it." Far to the south, Demiurge received the final report on Skarn Bloodmaw's warband with the same cold, meticulous precision he applied to every development, filing it alongside a note that carried, for the first time in this entire campaign, a genuine flicker of concern rather than mere calculation. The dragon has now demonstrated a clear, principled threshold for violence, restraint against calculated cruelty, total and merciless retaliation against atrocity. This threshold is, unfortunately, entirely legible to every chieftain in the Horde's leadership, and Grug Ironjaw's documented doubts are likely to accelerate, now that the dragon has offered an alternative moral framework, considerably more coherent than the one this campaign has provided. Sama should be informed that the Horde's internal cohesion is now a variable at genuine risk, and that the dragon's restraint, while so far convenient, cannot be relied upon indefinitely should further atrocities occur. He did not yet know how soon, or how completely, that risk would come due. Grug Ironjaw came to the dragon's camp alone, which was either the bravest or the stupidest thing he had done in 2 years of war, and he was honestly no longer certain which. He had left his tribe's banner behind at the tree line, along with every weapon his honor would allow him to set down, and walked the last quarter-mile into Alexstrasza's encampment with both empty hands raised, fully aware that every soldier of her flight, watching him approach, had every right, by any accounting of this war's atrocities, to end him before he spoke a single word. Alexstrasza, still healing but sharp-eyed as ever, was the one who stopped him at the perimeter, wings half spread, a low warning growl building in his throat that needed no translation. "I've come to speak with the Dragon Queen," Grug said, holding perfectly still, "not to fight her flight. If you mean to kill me for coming, do it quickly. I'd rather that than another season of dying slow under Jaldabaoth's promises." Alexstrasza arrived before Alexstrasza's growl resolved into anything worse, folding down out of the sky to land between them, gold eyes settling on the old Knoll chieftain with an unreadable, careful attention. "You're the one my flight scouts have marked," she said. "Ironjaw, the chieftain whose warband Rayhurst's massacre didn't come from." "It didn't," Grug said. "I wanted you to know that before you decide whatever you're about to decide about me. Skarn did that. My spears never touched that village." He drew a slow breath, the particular breath of a man about to say something that could end him. "I've come to ask for something I have no right to ask for, Dragon. I want out. My tribe, near 400 souls, counting the young and the old who can't fight. We're done bleeding for a demon lord's promises that keep shrinking every season. I want your protection, if you'll give it, long enough to get my people clear of this war entirely." The camp had gone very quiet. Alexstrasza's eyes were hard, weighing a Knoll chieftain who had, whatever his own restraint, spent 2 years fighting under the same banner that had produced Rayhurst. "You ask me to trust the word of a warband leader," Alexstrasza said carefully, "who has spent 2 years lending his spears to a horde that has burned villages, murdered children, driven an entire kingdom to the edge of collapse. Why should I believe your hands are cleaner than the rest?" "Because I'm not asking you to believe my hands are clean," Grug said. "They're not. I've killed Holy Kingdom soldiers who never did anything to my people beyond wearing the wrong uniform in a war neither of us started. I won't pretend otherwise to earn your mercy cheap. What I'm telling you is that my people never chose atrocity. We chose survival 2 years ago, on the strength of a promise that's proven to be nothing but arithmetic dressed up as hope. And I'm asking you, Dragon, because you're the only power in this entire war I've seen answer cruelty with consequence, and answer nothing else with anything worse than what it earned. Skarn's warband got exactly what Rayhurst bought them. My tribe hasn't bought that yet. I'm trying to make sure it never does. It was, Alexstrasza understood immediately, exactly the kind of choice she had feared since Rayhurst. Not a clean line between atrocity and innocence, but a genuine, unbearable weighing of complicated truths against each other. Grug's tribe had fought in a war of slaughter, had killed soldiers who bore no more guilt than any conscript on any side of any war, and yet they had not committed what Skarn's warband committed, had in fact been actively resisting the currents that produced it, and stood now at the edge of an honest attempt to leave a war they'd been lied into joining. She thought of Nea lowering her crossbow on instinct. She thought of the young Knoll cub dying under a Death Knight's proportional response, a policy that made no distinction for age or intention, only action. She thought of Ains's honest, unbearable calculation, and understood, with sudden clarity, that she was about to face the same choice he had described to her across that pavilion table, the choice between a clean principle and a costly mercy, and that whichever way she chose, someone innocent would very likely pay for it. If I grant this, she said slowly, and your tribe is later found among the Horde's remaining forces by the Holy Kingdom's soldiers, or by the Sorceress Kingdom's army, soldiers who have buried friends and family to demi-human spears these 2 years past, do you understand what happens? They will not see a chieftain who tried to leave. They will see one more enemy who fought until convenient, then claimed mercy the moment the war turned against him. I understand it, Grug said. I've turned it over every night since I decided to come here. I'm asking anyway, because the alternative is watching my people die for a demon lord's arithmetic that was never going to pay out, and I would rather risk a mercy that costs me everything than continue serving a lie that costs my people everything for certain. Alexstrasza was quiet for a long moment, and the camp around her held its breath along with her. I will grant it, she said finally, but I will not do it in secret, and I will not do it without cost to you, Ironjaw. Your tribe surrenders every weapon capable of harming a soul in this war. You submit to escort, my flight's escort, visible, undeniable, through neutral ground to wherever the Holy Kingdom is willing to receive refugees, and you answer, honestly, to whatever accounting the Holy Kingdom demands of you for the blood your spears have already spilled. I will protect your people from slaughter. I will not protect you from justice, if justice is what's owed. That's more than fair, Grug said, and something in his old, weathered face looked, for the first time in longer than he could remember, almost like relief. That's more than I had any right to ask for. Remedios Custodio did not agree. She arrived at the neutral crossing point 3 days later, with a full company at her back, silver blonde hair pulled tight, blue eyes fixed on the column of nearly 400 demi-humans, chieftain, elders, children, all of it, moving under Alexstrasza's escort toward Holy Kingdom lines, and the fury in her stance was not performed. You want me to welcome them, Remedios said, voice flat and cold. After Rayhurst, after every village this war has taken from us, you want my soldiers, half of whom buried family to demi-human spears, to simply stand aside and let 400 of them walk into our territory because you decided they deserve mercy. I decided they deserve a chance to prove they've earned it, Alexstrasza said, which is not the same thing, Captain, and I understand exactly how much I'm asking of your soldiers by asking it. I do not ask you to forget what this horde has done. I ask you to distinguish between the warband that committed Rayhurst and the chieftain who refused to lend it his spears. And I ask it precisely because I believe your kingdom is better than a policy that treats every demi-human face as equally guilty regardless of what stands behind it. And if you're wrong, Remedios's voice had gone dangerously quiet. If this is one more trick, one more Jaldabaoth game dressed up as an old chieftain's regret, my soldiers will have opened our lines to 400 armed. Unarmed, Alexstrasza corrected. Every weapon capable of harm has already been surrendered to my flight. I have flown escort over this column myself for 3 days, Captain. If I believed for one moment this was deception, I would have ended it long before it reached your border. Remedios's jaw worked. Some old, exhausted war fought silently behind her eyes between the soldier who had lost too much to this war to extend anything resembling grace, and the captain who had, despite everything, chosen to trust the dragon's honesty once already, and found that trust rewarded. "There's a boy in my company," Remedios said finally, quiet now, "who watched his whole family die when the horde took his village. 16 years old. He's going to see this column crossing into our territory, Dragon, and he is going to have to find some way to live beside it. I don't know if he can, I don't know if I can, and I've had considerably more practice burying grief than he has. I don't have an answer that makes that easier," Alexstrasza said, and meant it, the honesty costing her something to say plainly. "I only have the accounting I've made, weighed as carefully as I know how, that punishing 400 souls, including children who never held a weapon, for a war they didn't choose and a massacre they didn't commit, does not honor what Rayhurst cost you. It only adds a second tragedy to the first, and calls it justice." For a long, terrible moment, Remedios said nothing at all, staring past Alexstrasza at the column still waiting, patient and afraid, at the crossing point, old gnolls and orcs and their children, watching the fate of their entire lives being decided by a conversation they couldn't hear. "Fine," Remedios said finally, the word costing her visibly, every syllable of it. "They cross. Under guard. Under the accounting you promised, Dragon. Every one of them answers honestly for what they've done, and if any one of them lied about their hands being clean, I will hold you personally responsible for what happens next." Her eyes, hard and wet at once, found Alexstrasza's. "And you tell that boy in my company, when he asks why, that it was your mercy that let this happen, not mine. I want him to understand exactly whose judgment he's living beside now." The column crossed at dusk, in silence. 400 souls walking into a kingdom that had every reason in the world to hate them, and had chosen, at painful cost, to extend something less than welcome, but more than slaughter instead. Nia watched it from the ramparts, standing beside a boy she didn't know by name yet, 16, hollow-eyed, hands gripping the rampart's edge hard enough to whiten his knuckles, and did not know what to say to him either, so she simply stayed close, the same useless, necessary stillness she'd offered the children of Rayhurst days before. "How can she ask this of us?" the boy said. "Not really to Nea, not really to anyone. How can any of it be fair?" "I don't think it's supposed to be fair," Nea said slowly, working the thought out loud as she found it. "I think it's supposed to be the least unfair thing anyone could find, out of a war that stopped being fair a long time before either of us understood what fair even meant." The boy said nothing to that, only watched the column pass beneath them, old gnoll elders and frightened children, walking into an uncertain mercy, and somewhere in his silence, Nea understood that the cost of Alexstrasza's choice would not be measured only in the accounting Remedios had demanded, or the justice the Holy Kingdom's courts would eventually render. It would be measured, too, in every soldier and refugee who now had to find some way to live beside a mercy their grief had never asked for, a cost the dragon herself had already accepted. Plainly and without illusion, the moment she decided that the alternative was worse. Alexstrasza watched the crossing from a distance, apart from the column now that her escort's duty was discharged, and felt the particular, familiar ache of a lifebinder who had made the only choice she could live with, and understood, without needing anyone to tell her, that it would cost her something in every direction regardless. Trust from the Holy Kingdom she'd just asked to swallow an unbearable mercy. Resentment from soldiers whose grief had no room left for nuance, and perhaps, somewhere down a road she couldn't yet see, a reckoning with Grug Ironjaw's own honesty that might not end as gently as this crossing had. This is the cost Ainz described to me, she thought, watching the last of the column pass through the gates. Not cruelty, just the unbearable weight of a calculation that costs someone, no matter which way it falls. I understand him a great deal better tonight than I did across that pavilion table. I still do not know if that makes me trust him more, or fear, for the first time, that I am becoming something closer to him than I ever intended to be. Saint Dorcas Vasion had heard the reports the way he heard most reports concerning power he had not yet personally verified, with polite, unhurried skepticism. A dragon of unknown origin, arriving through no summoning circle this world's archives recognized, matching a guardian of Nazarick in open combat, and walking away with the argument still unsettled. It sounded to the Platinum Dragon Lord's considerable experience like exactly the kind of exaggeration that traveled faster than truth in a war already drowning in rumor. He had lived long enough, borne the weight of Dragon Lord long enough, to know that most claims of unprecedented power dissolved on close inspection into ordinary strength wearing an extraordinary story. He went to see for himself anyway, because the small remaining fraction of the report that did not dissolve on inspection was the fraction that mattered most, that whatever this creature was, she had killed a warband commander for atrocity, and touched nothing beyond it, and that this was not, by any account he'd gathered, the behavior of a monster indifferent to the world it had fallen into. It was the behavior, he thought, turning the reports over during the long flight north, of something that had already decided what it believed the world owed its weaker inhabitants. And Saint Dorcas Vasion had spent the better part of his long life deeply, personally frustrated by how few beings with power enough to act on such beliefs ever actually bothered to. He found her at dusk, standing at the edge of her flight's encampment, and did not bother with the theater of a dramatic arrival. He simply descended, folded his considerable bulk down into a respectful landing some distance off, and waited to see whether she would greet a stranger with the same restraint she'd shown, by all accounts, to everyone who hadn't yet earned her fire. "You're not one of Ainz Ualgaun's guardians," Alexstrasza said, studying him with an attention that held more curiosity than alarm. "And you're not Horde. What are you?" "Saint Dorcas Vasion," he said, folding down into a humanoid shape with the unhurried dignity of someone who had made this exact introduction countless times across a very long life. "Called by some the Platinum Dragon Lord, though I've never much cared for the title's implied arrogance. Son of the Dragon Emperor, one of 5 counselors of the Argland Council State, for whatever that's worth to you at this distance. I came to see for myself whether the reports about you held any truth, and I find, having met you, that most of them understated the matter rather than exaggerated it." "You're a dragon," Alexstrasza said, something in her voice shifting toward a kinship she hadn't allowed herself with anyone else in this world. "A true one. This world has its own dragons after all. We have ruled here, and been broken here, and endured here, longer than most of this world's kingdoms have existed to write histories about it," Saint Dorcas said. "I confess, Lady Alexstrasza, that is the name I've gathered. Forgive me if it's wrong. I did not expect to feel any particular kinship with a foreign anomaly dropped into the middle of our worst ongoing catastrophe. And yet," he paused, considering her with the same careful attention she'd offered him, "there is something in the shape of you I recognize. Not merely dragon, older than that, closer to what my own kind once was, before the greed kings broke our reign here and taught us the specific, permanent humility of losing a war we believed we could not lose. I am an aspect, Alexstrasza said. A steward in my world, of life itself. I did not come to rule anything here, Dragon Lord. I fell into the middle of a slaughter and found I could not simply fly away from it. No, Sandorcus agreed. I don't imagine you could. That, more than the fire itself, is what convinced me the reports were true. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, something more guarded entered his voice. May I speak plainly with you, Lady Alexstrasza? I have watched this war's true architect for some time now, from a greater distance than I'm entirely comfortable with. I do not think you have yet seen the whole of what Untold is capable of, nor the whole of what troubles me about a power of his magnitude operating without any check this world can meaningfully offer him. I have met him, Alexstrasza said carefully. I have seen his order up close. I do not pretend I found it comfortable. Comfortable is not the word I would reach for either, Sandorcus said. I do not call him evil, Lady Alexstrasza. I have watched too many of his actual choices to make that accusation honestly, and I distrust the ease with which lesser minds reach for it. But I have watched power like his, unchecked long enough, in enough different rulers across enough different ages, to know the shape it eventually takes even in hands that begin with the best of intentions. I do not believe Untold intends cruelty. I believe, more troublingly, that he has simply stopped believing anyone in this world is capable of holding him accountable if his intentions ever change. And a mind that stops expecting accountability, however carefully it reasons today, rarely stays as careful forever. You want me to stand against him? I want you to understand, Sandorcus said, that I have not yet decided to stand against him myself, and I would not ask you to make that choice before I've made it. What I ask, Lady Alexstrasza, is simpler and considerably more selfish, that whatever you decide about this war, you decide it as something more than one more piece he's managed to fold into his calculations. I have watched entire kingdoms bend themselves, quietly and reasonably, into shapes that served his order rather than their own judgment, each bend individually defensible, the sum of them a kind of slow surrender no single choice inside it ever looked like surrender at all. I would rather you kept your own judgment intact, whatever it eventually concludes, than lost it one reasonable concession at a time the way I've watched happen to wiser rulers than either of us. Alexstrasza was quiet for a long moment, turning the warning over with the same careful weight she'd given every hard truth this world had offered her since her arrival. You speak as someone who has already lost that fight once. I have watched it lost more times than I care to count, Sandorcus said, something old and tired moving behind his otherwise composed bearing. The dragon kingdom my own family founded is dying by inches even now. Under a beastman invasion, my great-granddaughter fights nearly alone because I have spent my own strength elsewhere, on battles I judged more urgent. I do not offer you my warning from a position of having solved anything myself, Lady Alexstrasza. I offer it because I recognize, in you, one of the very few powers in this entire war, who might still be early enough in her own reckoning to choose differently than I did. She thought of Draudalon Auriculus, a name she hadn't heard before Sandorcus spoke it. A great-granddaughter fighting a losing war nearly alone, while the greater powers of this world spent their strength elsewhere, and felt something shift in her understanding of the shape of this conflict, wider now than the Holy Kingdom's collapse alone. Tell me about your kingdom's war, she said, the one you say you're not fighting. The Beastman country presses our borders harder every season, Sandorcus said. My great-granddaughter Draudalon holds the throne, and holds it well, with considerably less support from the rest of us than she deserves. I have spent my own attention on Untold's rise because I judged it the larger threat to the world's balance. And I confess, hearing myself say it aloud to you now, that the judgment sounds considerably more self-serving than I intended it when I made it. A long pause, and then quieter. Perhaps that is the true warning I came here to offer you, Lady Alexstrasza, more than any accusation against the Sorcerer King. Even the most careful among us, even those of us old enough to know better, find ways to justify letting one urgent crisis excuse our absence from another. I would not have you make the same mistake I have already made, weighing this war's largest power so closely that you forget the smaller wars still bleeding at its edges. Alexstrasza looked north, toward her own flight's encampment, toward the war she had already spent weeks weighing with exactly the careful, exhausting attention Dorcas described, and felt, for the first time, the specific vertigo of understanding that the war she'd fallen into was not the only war in this world worth her fire, and that choosing where to stand in one conflict did not absolve her of the question of where she owed attention in every other. I cannot fight every war this world contains, she said finally. I understand that, painfully, more each day I remain here, but I will not forget your warning, Dragon Lord, about Ain's Ualgaun, and about the smaller wars that go unanswered, while the larger ones consume every eye in the room. If there comes a day I can offer your great-granddaughter's kingdom something more than attention, I will remember that you asked. That is more than I expected to receive from this conversation, Dorcas said, rising, wings unfurling with the same unhurried dignity he'd carried since his arrival. I did not come here for a promise, Lady Alexstrasza. I came to see whether the reports were true, and to offer the one warning I judged worth the risk of this journey. You have given me more than I asked for in return. I will not forget it either. He left as he had arrived, without theater, and Alexstrasza stood alone at the edge of her encampment for a long while after, turning over the weight of a second power's honest warning, alongside every calculation Ain's Ualgaun had already asked her to make, understanding, with a clarity that settled cold and permanent in her chest, that the true shape of this world's danger was not any single villain's cruelty, but the slow, reasonable, individually defensible accumulation of choices that any power, however well-intentioned at its start, might make on the road to becoming something it never meant to be. The Horde's final assault on the Holy Kingdom capital came 3 weeks after Grug Ironjaw's crossing, and it came apart before it ever truly began. Alexstrasza felt it from the air before her scouts confirmed it. A horde that should have struck as one overwhelming tide, instead breaking into ragged, uncoordinated waves, warbands hesitating at the tree line, entire contingents simply failing to advance when the horn sounded. Grug's defection had cost the horde more than 400 spears. It had cost Jaldabaoth's careful 2-year fiction its single most valuable asset, the appearance of unshakable unity, and every chieftain who'd ever privately doubted the Demon Lord's shrinking promises now had living proof that doubt could be survived. She watched it from a ridge above the capital's outer walls, Alexstrasza beside her, and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite dread settle over her instead. It's breaking, Alexstrasza said. The horde. It's actually breaking. Something is breaking, Alexstrasza said, and did not yet have words for the specific unease crawling up her spine. I don't think it's only the horde, she was right, though she would not understand exactly how right for another hour. Cocytus found her as the ragged battle below sorted itself into a rout, forearms folded in a posture she'd learned to read as genuine distress beneath his rigid formality. There is something you should know, he said, without preamble, before this day's events reach their conclusion. And before you draw conclusions, I would rather you draw with full understanding, rather than partial truth. I ask that you hear it from me, honestly, rather than discover it in a manner that costs you trust in something I still believe deserves it. Say it plainly, Cocytus. Jaldabaoth, Cocytus said, is not a demon lord who happens to serve Ain Sama's interests. He is Demiurge, My fellow guardian, the mask, the horde, the entire war you have been fighting to end, it was constructed, from its beginning, to create precisely the crisis that would justify Ainsama's intervention, and precisely the gratitude that would follow it. The world went very still around her. The atrocities, she said, very quietly. Rayhurst, the villages before it, the 2 years of slaughter your fellow guardian personally administered against a country he was, in truth, always going to save. Skarn Bloodmaw's massacre at Rayhurst was not ordered by Demiurge, Cocytus said, and something in his honor-bound bearing tightened with what she recognized, finally, as genuine discomfort with his own answer. That atrocity exceeded the campaign's design and was not sanctioned. But the war itself, its scale, its duration, the specific despair it was calculated to produce in this kingdom before its salvation arrived. Yes, that was architecture. Ainsama's, ultimately, however much of the design Demiurge executed with his own particular enthusiasm. Alexstrasza said nothing for a long moment, and Cocytus, watching her, seemed to brace for a fury he clearly believed himself deserving of. "You could have let me learn this from someone with less honor than you," she said finally. "Why tell me yourself?" "Because I gave you my word, on a hillside, that I would deal with you honestly," Cocytus said. "And because I have carried this knowledge with a weight I do not enjoy carrying, Lady Alexstrasza, and find I would rather it cost me your trust honestly than preserve it through a silence I cannot fully justify to my own code." She found Ain's Uolgaun an hour later, in a command pavilion erected within sight of the capital's walls, watching the horde's collapse unfold across a map with the same unhurried, hollow patience he brought to every calculation, and she did not wait for courtesy before she spoke. "You built this war," she said, "to save the very kingdom you built it to destroy." Ain's did not deny it. She noted that immediately, and it cost her something, some small, foolish part of her that had wanted, after their honest pavilion conversation weeks before, to be told this was a lie. "Yes," he said simply. "We say the rest of it," Alexstrasza said, plainly, "as you promised me you would. A kingdom that watches its own collapse and its own salvation both arrive from the same source, learns gratitude faster and more thoroughly than a kingdom simply conquered." Ain said, "I did not architect a war for its own sake, Lady Alexstrasza. I architected a crisis precise enough to make my kingdom's eventual intervention feel, to every soul who survives it, like deliverance rather than annexation. The alternative, conquest without that gratitude, costs more blood in the long accounting, not less, in every projection I have run. I have watched kingdoms resist rulers who took them by force for generations after the conquest itself ended. I have rarely watched a population resist the ruler who arrived, at the darkest possible hour, to save them from something worse. Rayhurst," she said, "Skarn Bloodmaw's warband. The children who died in that square did not die for your calculation. They died because a commander you did not fully control decided cruelty was strategy, inside a war you built the stage for." For the first time since she'd met him, something in Ains's hollow voice carried what she thought, with careful, uncertain attention, might genuinely be regret. "Skarn Bloodmaw's actions exceeded the parameters of the design," he said. "I will not hide behind that distinction to excuse myself entirely. A system I built produced the conditions that allowed a commander like him to rise unchecked within it, and that failure is mine to carry, whatever I intended. But I did not want Rayhurst, Lady Alexstrasza. I did not design for it. When Demiurge's reports of it reached me, He stopped, and the pause carried more weight than any words that might have filled it. "It cost me more than I expected it to." "That is not the same as innocence." "No," Ainz agreed. "It is not. I do not ask you to grant me innocence, Lady Alexstrasza. I ask you to weigh, as you have weighed everything else in this war, what the alternative actually looks like. This kingdom's population, when the Horde's remnants are finally cleared from these lands, will believe they were saved. That belief will hold this region stable for a generation, sparing the resistance, the insurgency, the endless grinding cost of holding a population that knows itself conquered, rather than delivered. I have built an empire on calculations exactly this uncomfortable, and I have never once pretended to you, across any conversation we've had, that the comfort of the story I tell this kingdom's people is the same as the truth of how their salvation was actually engineered. Alexstrasza stood in the pavilion for a long moment, turning over the full, unbearable weight of what she now understood. A war engineered from its first spark, a slaughter of thousands calculated as necessary theater, a kingdom's coming gratitude built on a foundation of manufactured despair. She thought of Nea Baraja, who would likely spend the rest of her life believing the Sorcerer King had arrived, at the darkest hour, to save a kingdom that had never known it was also his to break. She thought of Remedios Custodio, whose grief over every soldier lost to this war had been, in some measure she could not yet fully calculate, a cost knowingly accepted by a ruler who considered it cheaper than the alternative. She thought of Grug Ironjaw, whose 2 years of shrinking promises had been, in truth, never meant to be honored at all, simply fuel, spent and discarded, in a design he'd never been permitted to see the shape of. "You asked me once," she said slowly, "to judge your kingdom by its conduct, not its promises. I have judged it, Ein Zualgaun, and I find that the conduct I've witnessed, the honest calculation, the reluctant cost-counting, the border policy that killed a child without cruelty and without mercy in equal measure, all of it was true, every word of it. And it was also, in its entirety, a performance staged for an audience that would never know it was watching one." "Yes," Ein said again, and did not flinch from the accusation. "Then tell me plainly what happens now," Alexstrasza said. "Not the calculation, the truth. What becomes of this kingdom once your manufactured salvation concludes?" "It becomes part of the Sorcerer's kingdom," Ein said. "Not through conquest, the population will ever recognize as conquest. Through gratitude, freely offered, for a rescue they will never learn was also the disease. I will govern it, as I govern everywhere I have expanded, with the same order you have already judged. Reasonable, costly, absolute. I will not pretend to you that this is a gentler outcome than open annexation would have been, Lady Alexstrasza. I will only argue, as I have argued from the first night we spoke, that it costs less blood in total than every alternative I have modeled, however much more blood it costs in the specific, individual tragedies, like Rayhurst, that no design, however careful, ever fully prevents." She left the pavilion without answering him, and found Cocytus waiting outside, patient and honorable, and clearly braced for whatever judgment she'd arrived at. "You knew this the entire time we spoke on that hillside," she said. "Every honest word you gave me about your own code, your own honor, you gave it to me while carrying a truth that would have unmade every trust I extended you, had I known it." "Yes," Cocytus said, and did not look away from the weight of it. "I have turned that over more than I care to admit, Lady Alexstrasza, in the time since. I believe in my own honor. I believe, with equal conviction, in my service to Ein Sama. Those two beliefs have not always sat easily together in this particular war, and I will not pretend to you that they have. I told you the truth the moment I judged I could tell it to you without betraying an order I was not given leave to break. That is the honest limit of what I could offer you, and I understand if it is not enough. It is more honest than most of what this world has offered me," Alexstrasza said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "I do not forgive the design, Cocytus. I do not know if I can forgive a war built from its first spark to manufacture the gratitude of the people it slaughtered along the way. But I do not think you are the same as the design, and I will not pretend otherwise simply because it would be easier to hate everything wearing Nazarik's banner at once. She found Grug Ironjaw last, among the refugee camps his own crossing had established weeks before, and told him the truth she'd learned, because she had promised herself, somewhere in the long unraveling of this war's true shape, that she would not become one more power in this world that managed people's understanding for their own convenience. He was silent for a long time after she finished, old and weathered and absorbing a truth that reframed 2 years of his own life into something considerably crueler than he'd ever suspected. "So my people bled," he said finally, "for a story someone else needed told." "Yes," Alexstrasza said. "I am sorry. You deserve to know it plainly, whatever the cost of hearing it." 2 years, Grug said, wondering whether Jaldabaoth's promises were simply failing, or simply lies. And the truth is worse than either. The truth is, we were never meant to receive anything at all, because we were never the point. We were just the fire someone else needed burning long enough to make their rescue look like mercy. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the refugee fires burning low across the camp his own defection had built. "What do I do with that, dragon? What does any of my people do with a truth like that?" "I don't know," Alexstrasza said honestly. "I have been asking myself the same question since Cocytus told me an hour ago, and I have not yet found an answer that costs less than the truth itself. But I know this much. You crossed when you learned enough to know your people deserved better than what they were being given. That choice was real, Grug Ironjaw, whatever the larger design behind it. Your people's survival, and the 400 lives you saved by choosing it, are not made false by the truth of what you were fighting inside. Hold on to that, if nothing else. It is not everything, but it is not nothing either." She flew north alone, as the sun set over a war finally, truly ending, not with the clean, earned victory she had hoped to find some way to help deliver, but with something far more complicated. A kingdom saved by the same hand that had engineered its suffering, a demon lord's mask about to be lifted, before a grateful, unknowing populace, a calculation so vast and so patient that even the truth of it, once known, changed almost nothing about what would happen next. "This is the thing I could not see from across that pavilion table," she thought, watching the last fires of the horde's broken remnant gutter out below her. Not merely a ruler who counts the cost of a war he did not start, a ruler who writes the war himself, and counts the cost of his own authorship, as though it were simply weather he happened to be standing in when it arrived. "I do not know, Ainzualgaon, whether that makes you the most dangerous power I have ever met, or simply the most honest architect of a cruelty this world has ever produced. I suspect, before I leave this world, I will need to decide which, and I suspect the answer will cost me something I am not yet ready to name." Behind her, in a command pavilion overlooking a kingdom about to believe itself saved, Ainzualgaon watched a dragon's silhouette shrink against the darkening sky, and felt, in the hollow, patient stillness where a heartbeat should have been, the specific and unfamiliar discomfort of having been known, fully, honestly, without the comfort of a story managed for the audience watching, by the one power in this entire war he had never quite finished calculating. She gave Ainzualgaon her answer 3 days later, in the same neutral pavilion where they'd first spoken plainly to each other, and this time she did not come alone. Alexstrasza stood at her right hand. Cocytus, at his own quiet request and with what she understood to be Ainz's genuine permission, stood witness at the pavilion's edge, forearms folded in solemn attention. And behind Alexstrasza, at a distance that spoke of exactly how much trust remained to extend and no more, stood Grug Ironjaw, old, weathered, present because she had asked him to be, so that whatever was decided here would be decided with the one voice from this war's true cost, still able to speak for it. "I have made my judgment," Alexstrasza said, before Ainz could offer any opening courtesy. "I will not ally my flight to your kingdom's calculations, Ainz Uelgaun. Not after learning what those calculations were willing to spend to write themselves a grateful ending. But I will not stand against you either. Not today. Not for this war's design, terrible as I find it, because I have watched what the alternatives to your order have already cost this land, and I am not fool enough to pretend a war against you now would spare a single soul who has already bled enough." "Then what do you ask of me?" Ainz said, and something in his hollow voice held the particular stillness of a ruler genuinely uncertain, for once, which answer was coming. "Terms," Alexstrasza said, "not for my flight. For the cost of your design that I am not willing to let vanish quietly into your kingdom's grateful story. Grug Ironjaw's people, and every chieftain who chose the same defection, receive full amnesty, not conditional mercy pending future suspicion, but the same standing as any subject who comes under your order honestly. The Holy Kingdom's people are told the truth of Demiurge's mask, in full, when the war's official history is written, not to shame your kingdom's rescue, but because a population that believes its salvation was pure will build its gratitude on a lie, and I have watched enough of this world's lies compound already to want one less standing when I leave it. And Rayhurst's dead are named, publicly, as victims of a commander who exceeded even your design's cruelty, not folded silently into the war's general cost, but accounted for specifically, so that the one true atrocity in this war is never mistaken for policy." Ainz was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried something she had not heard from him before. Not calculation, but something closer to genuine consideration of terms that cost him more in comfort than in actual resource. "The amnesty I grant freely," he said. "I had already intended as much for those who defected in good faith. You ask only that I make it unconditional rather than probationary, and I judge that concession small against what it earns in your continued restraint. The naming of Rayhurst's dead and the accounting of the true commander responsible, that I also grant, because it costs my kingdom little, and I do not believe in building order on a lie larger than necessary." A pause, longer this time. "The truth of Demiurge's mask, told plainly to a population I have spent 2 years engineering to believe otherwise. That is the term that costs me most, Lady Alexstrasza, and I will not pretend otherwise. It undoes, in a single truth, the very foundation my design was built to produce." "I know," Alexstrasza said. "I am not asking you to make this easy for yourself. I am asking you to prove that the honesty you offered me across this same table, weeks ago, extends beyond what's convenient for you to extend it to." For a long moment, the pavilion held its breath along with everyone in it. Corielstrass tense at her side, Cocytus utterly still at the tent's edge, Grug Ironjaw watching with the particular held stillness of a man who had waited 2 years to see whether any power in this war would finally choose truth over convenient arithmetic. "I will tell them," Ainz said finally. "Not all at once, and not without the careful framing my kingdom's stability requires. I will not pretend to you that I intend to abandon every calculation simply because you have asked it of me. But the truth of Demiurge's mask will reach this kingdom's people, in full, within the year. That is the honest term I can offer you, Lady Alexstrasza. I will not promise you more than I intend to deliver." "That is enough," Alexstrasza said, and meant it, not because the terms undid the design's cruelty, but because they were the most honest concession this war had produced from any power she'd met inside it, and she had learned, across every hard lesson this world had offered her, that the honest, imperfect answer was worth more than the clean answer no one actually intended to keep. The truth of Jaldabaoth reached the Holy Kingdom's people 6 months later, delivered with exactly the careful framing Ines had promised, and exactly the honesty his terms required. Not a confession offered freely, but a truth that could no longer be hidden once Alexstrasza herself, before departing, told Nea Baraja and Remedios Custodio plainly what she had learned, understanding that soldiers who had bled for a manufactured war deserved, at minimum, to carry that knowledge forward however they chose to. Nea wept when she heard it, not for herself, but for every soldier beside her who would spend the rest of their lives believing they'd been saved by something that had also, in its careful architecture, been willing to let Rayhurst happen as an acceptable cost of the design. Remedios said nothing at all for a long while, jaw tight, some old and exhausted fury finding, at last, a shape large enough to hold it, and then, finally, asked the only question that mattered to a soldier who had spent this entire war learning to live beside unbearable calculations. "Does knowing change anything?" she asked. "Now that the war's ended, now that my people are under his order regardless of what we learn about how we got here, does the truth actually change what happens next?" "No," Alexstrasza admitted, "not the outcome. Only what you carry forward knowing it. I cannot promise you that costs less than not knowing at all, Captain. I can only tell you that I have watched enough of this world's lies compound to believe, all the same, that it is worth the cost." Grug Ironjaw's people settled, in the months that followed, into a modest stretch of borderland the Sorceress Kingdom granted them, under the amnesty's honest terms. Not the vast promised coastline Jaldabaoth had dangled for 2 years, but real land, honestly held, worked by 400 souls who had chosen, at the cost of everything they'd fought for, to leave a lie before it consumed them entirely. Grug visited Alexstrasza's flight once more before her departure, old and tired and carrying, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that looked almost like peace. "You didn't have to ask for what you asked for," he said. "The amnesty, the truth told plainly. None of it changed your own path, Dragon. You could have taken your flight home the moment the fighting stopped, and left the rest of this world's reckoning to sort itself without you." "I could have," Alexstrasza agreed. "I chose not to, because I have learned in this world that the difference between a power that merely survives a war and a power that actually changes what it costs the people caught inside it is not measured in the battles it wins. It is measured in whether it stays long enough, after the fighting ends, to make sure the truth outlasts the convenient story built on top of it." She studied the old chieftain for a long moment, gold eyes warm, despite everything this world had shown her. "Your people have a real chance now, Grug Ironjaw. Not because I gave it to them, because you chose, at real cost to yourself, to stop serving a lie the moment you understood it was won. Hold on to that. It is the truest thing this war produced." The rift home opened 9 days later, not through any deliberate summoning, but through the same strange cold resonance that had first torn Alexstrasza and her flight into this world, now settling, at last, into a shape that mirrored rather than merely tore. Alexstrasza found it first, a shimmer in the sky above the same ridge where they'd first gathered the scattered flight together, and Alexstrasza felt, standing before it, the particular vertigo of an ending she had not expected to receive so cleanly. Cocytus came to see them off, formal and honorable to the last, and Ainzual Gaun himself sent no envoy at all, only a single message, carried by Cocytus, that Alexstrasza read once and did not share with anyone else in her flight. "I do not know if what I have built here is mercy or merely the most durable cruelty I could construct," the message read. "You have made me question that more thoroughly than any power in this world has managed in a very long time. I do not know if I thank you for that, or resent you for it. Perhaps honestly both. Travel safely, Lady Alexstrasza. I suspect this world will remember you a great deal longer than it remembers the war you arrived inside." She folded the message away, and did not answer it, because there was nothing left to say that the terms they'd already struck hadn't already said more honestly than any parting words could manage. They tell it differently now, in the towns that survived the Sacred Kingdom's long agony, not as the Sorcerer King's salvation alone, though that story is still told, still believed by many who choose the comfort of it over the harder truth beneath. They tell it, too, as the year the dragons came, a Red Queen who fell out of a broken sky into the middle of someone else's slaughter, who burned exactly what earned her fire and spared exactly what didn't, who looked at a war, built from its first spark, to manufacture its own grateful ending, and refused to let that architecture stand entirely unchallenged, even knowing she could not undo it. Nea Baraja tells the story to soldiers younger than she once was, careful to include the parts that cost the telling something. Rayhurst's true account, Grug Ironjaw's honest defection, the unbearable weight of a mercy that asked a grieving kingdom to open its gates to the very people it had every right to hate. Remedios Custodio tells it less often, and never without the particular ache of a soldier who learned, at the war's true end, that even the truth doesn't always make the grief easier to carry, only more honestly hers to carry. And somewhere in a stretch of honestly held borderland, an old chieftain who once led 400 souls out of a lie tells his own grandchildren a simpler version, the one that matters most to people who lived it, rather than merely witnessed it from a safe distance, that once, when the whole world seemed built from calculations too large for any one person to survive weighing, a dragon queen chose to weigh them anyway, and paid the cost of that choice honestly, all the way to the end. Alexstrasza carried the weight of it home with her, through a rift that closed behind her flight with the same cold, strange finality it had opened with, carried the memory of a dying knoll cub, an honest king's unbearable calculation, an old chieftain's costly courage, and the particular, permanent knowledge that even the most careful power in any world eventually has to choose, not between clean answers, but between which unbearable cost it can live beside. She did not know, flying at last back into her own sky, whether she had changed that world for the better in any way its histories would remember accurately. She knew only that she had refused, at every turn that mattered, to let convenience write the ending in her place, and that in a world ruled by the deathless, that refusal, however small it looked against the scale of everything else, had been the truest fire she had to give.